Night gradually arrived, enveloping the mountain forests. On the contrary, however, the outer mountains only grew even more busy. After the disciple classification announcement in the day, secretly undercurrents flowed violently between the numerous new disciples. As the saying went, wherever there were people, there will be conflict. Even the spirit-devouring mountain was no exception. Majority of the new disciples were fresh off the boat. Several of the more quick-witted ones began to call friends together to form factions. In any place, a faction would clearly have an advantage over an individual. The existence of first-class disciples became the core of several groups, rapidly increasing their status. As such, the brightly lit little houses in the mountains became a hub of activity. In one of the little houses, several dozen people were gathered, making the atmosphere pretty lively. Levo was also included amongst them. Two individuals were seated in the center, like a moon, surrounded by stars. Calm indifference filled their expressions as they enjoyed the respect from the surrounding crowd. These two were obviously first-class disciples. One was called Seo Kath, while the other was named Park Karai. Levo wore a bright smile as he declared, "All of us will follow Brother Seo and Brother Park in future." The others nodded. Seo Kath and Park Karai were sure to enter the 7 Peaks and had bright futures ahead of them. Now was clearly the best time to curry favor. Seo Kath chuckled and said, "All of us from the other continents, and cannot compare to the infamous Shurian and Ryan geniuses. So we naturally need to take extra care of each other." One of the individuals in the group angrily said, "Those from the Shurian and Ryan continent are really too arrogant. Just earlier, I tried to invite a second-class disciple on Brother Seo's behalf, but that fellow didn't give any face at all." Seo Kath's expression darkened slightly when he heard this, but he still waved his hand and said, "We just have to do our best. Since the geniuses of those 2 continents are so prideful, there is no need for us to be friendly just to be snubbed." Park Karai nodded in approval. "There seems to be one other first-class disciples from this Naran continent, shall we go rope him in?" suggested someone. Levo sneered. "You mean the one that went through the back door?" Seo Kath shook his head. "Don't bother with the Naran people. I heard earlier that Peliok will be making his move against Ezra. Although Peliok is a second-class disciple, he is one of the Shurian continent's geniuses that has several formidable friends. Now that he had decided to move, Ezra will be beaten back to where he belongs tomorrow." Levo's eyes brightened when he heard this. Soon after, he chuckled and remarked, "What an unlucky guy. He can only enjoy a single day of first-class disciple status before falling to the bottom again." The others also roared in laughter, before no longer mentioning this subject. They clearly already believed that Ezra Zephyr would be the loser. Similar situations had happened several times in many places after all. Therefore, practically everyone came to know in a single night that when tomorrow come, Ezra would become the shortest-lived first-class disciple in history. When the first rays of the morning sun broke through the clouds and shined on the mountain forests, the outer mountains immediately became a hive of activity. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom pushed open the doors and walked out of the little house. The moment they left, they saw a group of people hurriedly rush towards them. They were Xyr, Zulfi, Dur, Shifa, Argus and the rest. The people of Naran met their leader as laughed and talked. Ezra felt something was troubling them. "What is it?" He looked at the worried crowd. Only then did Dur recall that there was a serious matter to report. Sweat dripped down his face as he anxiously said, "Not good, Your Majesty. I heard that someone is going to take your first-class disciple status today." "Haha, so it has come after all." Ezra's expression did not change when he heard this. He knew that such a situation would definitely occur. After all, who asked him to appear like the easiest target? "Do you know who it is?" Gil Subzi immediately answered, "He's called Peliok, a second-class disciple from the Shurian continent, second-level core formation stage." Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly as he faintly nodded with a wicked grin. A flash of red swept out from the mountain in the distance. It was Ravina in Gale. When she saw the situation here, her bright eyes shot a quick glance at Ezra, seemingly a little gloating. Evidently, even she already knew about this matter. The prince ignored the various gazes that were on him, merely nodding to Gil Subzi as he began to walk forward. Let's go to Energy Mountain. A tall, towering mountain rose amongst the many mountains in the outer mountain area, piercing straight through the clouds. This mountain was the most conspicuous of all the mountains. Not only was it a grand and majestic sight, its tip shaped like a volcano, while countless faint spiritual runes could be seen on its body, seemingly forming incomparably enormous spiritual rune boundaries. These rune boundaries were carved into every inch of the mountain. The surrounding spiritual energy was endlessly drawn over, flooding into the giant mountain. It was a very spectacular sight. When Ezra and gang arrived, a startled look was revealed on their faces as they gazed upon the giant of a mountain. What a sum they must have invested! Argus Waska could not help but exclaim in admiration. With his spiritual senses, he could feel that the spiritual runes in the giant mountain were all pretty high grade, while the rune boundaries were definitely not the work of any ordinary person. Evidently, there were existences in the spirit-devouring mountain that with powerful spirit cultivation. Such ingenious methods. Rarely seen amazement had appeared on Ezra's handsome face. Rarely seen amazement had appeared on Ezra's handsome face as he said, "There are likely over 20 spiritual rune boundaries in this giant mountain, each one closely interlinked. It's practically perfect." To accomplish such a feat, the martial prowess of the one who did this must at the very least be at the first level of spiritual transformation stage. First level of spiritual transformation stage, the rest only dropped their jaw in sheer shock. Ezra didn't make any guess, because he was told all of this by Fenrir himself. "It seems that this really is Energy Mountain," uttered Selzutton. The other martial masters of Naren continents gazed swept about, seeing streaks of spiritual energy endlessly streaming towards the place, ultimately landing on the giant mountain. They were the numerous new disciples. Ezra and gang were currently moving there. When the new disciples that arrived from all over saw him, they looked at him in a slightly smirking manner. These bastards are all waiting for His Majesty to be humiliated. Thor swore and cursed. XYR tapped his shoulders and said, "Believe in Master Ezra, he won't be troubled by such bugs." Thor looked at him. "Haha, yes, you are rig wait. Master Ezra. Since when His Majesty became your master?" "Since he defeated Carlo Or," replied XYR. The other Naren geniuses were also filled with feelings of indignation. They already knew that all of them had been marked as the same Naren group, while Ezra Zephyr was basically their representatives. Their relationship with Ezra basically consisted of the following: when Ezra gained glory, they would gain glory; when Ezra was shamed, they would be shamed. If Ezra's first-class disciple status was taken by Peliok today, they would also be implicated and be shunned by the others. The prince merely chuckled, not really angered by the situation. It was very normal for others want misfortune to befall him. After all, he appeared to be a mere first-level practitioner, and yet he had somehow managed to occupy one of the first-class disciple spots. As the saying went, treasuring a jade ring can become a crime. To him, the first-class disciple status was the jade ring. There was no way for him to use words to remove everyone's doubts, nor was it going to be effective. Hence, the atrocious werewolf preferred to use the most direct method. "Let me see how amazing this energy mountain is," said Ezra as the black and red lightning flickered beneath his feet as he jumped, rising through the air, ultimately landing on the enormous energy mountain. The rest followed him. Energy Mountain was majestic without equal. When they reached the waist of the mountain, the prince and the rest found numerous prowess platforms that were several feet wide installed on the mountain, reaching all the way from waist to the tip. A rough look would give an estimate of over 10,000, making it an extremely magnificent sight. However, the prowess platforms seemed to grow larger towards the mountain top. There were markings on every prowess platform that corresponded to their respective disciple status tokens. As such, no one could randomly occupy a platform. There were also several young boys in the area that were yelling, "First-class disciples may enter the peak, second-class disciples at the waist of the mountain, and third class at the bottom." It was clear that the spiritual energy at the peak would be the most concentrated. Hence why only first-class disciples had the right to enjoy the best positions, while second and third were treated accordingly. Upon hearing this, he looked at 4 individuals: Zulfi Dimitri, Shifa Pista, Argus Waska, and XYR. He didn't talk with XYR before, but he already grasped the willingness of XYR to serve him. You 4 must claim the first-class spots after they declare a fight with me. In case if they reject the duel, try your best and taunt them. It would be an easy fight for XYR, but you 3. Ezra said to trio werewolves who had 6th grade spirit. You must fight with everything, morph into werewolf form if possible. Your Majesty, we cannot control the power of morphing, said Shifa in embarrassed manner. She recalled how she appeared naked in front of their and Zulfi in Spirity Tower. Believe me, you will control it with ease now. After saying that, he temporarily split up with the rest, heading for the peak under the many watching envious gazes. As they neared the peak, they saw numerous cultivation platforms that were even wider than the ones below. What's more, faint spiritual runes could be seen on the stone that composed these platforms. Ezra followed the marking on his disciple token and landed on the stone cultivation platform that belonged to him, where he found a mat at the center. The mat gave off a faint golden glow and seemed weaved from countless gold threads. Spiritual energy faintly pulsed from it, indicating that it was a prowess support type of treasure. When Ezra sat on the mat, he immediately felt a cooling aura flow into his body, giving him a refreshing sensation. This instantly made him secretly praise inside. The prowess conditions provided by the spirit-devouring mountain were really going to be hard to let go of once one had tried them out. To hold on to these prowess resources and prevent others from taking them away, he needed to constantly move forward and surpass those around him. The prince sighed, before his gaze turned towards his front, where the most important object in the entire mountain was located. The blooming spirit flower. The golden flower before him was about 10 feet tall, while petals as large as a washbasin grew from it like a sunflower. Although it was a flower, Ezra could feel that it seemed to be slowly breathing. As it breathed, the surrounding spiritual energy flowed into it, making its petals grow increasingly dazzling. So this the blooming spirit flower? Ezra was impressed. It was said that the blooming spirit flower was a rare and unique treasure. It could continuously absorb energy, creating pollen that possessed the miraculous power of tempering the spiritual energy. This was what made it extremely pricey. The spirit-devouring mountain was clearly in possession of the method to grow these blooming spirit flowers, hence why they would own such a huge number of them. Utilizing the blooming spirit flower to prowess, can't believe the declining spirit-devouring mountain can even think of this. While Ezra continued to sigh, more and more disciples arrived at Energy Mountain. They eventually found their prowess platforms and began to excitedly observe the blooming spirit flowers. However, they soon stealthily raised their gazes, looking towards a certain spot near the peak where Ezra was currently located. SWWIISSH. A streak of light descended from the sky, coming to a halt above the peak. Spiritual energy took the shape of a cloud as Ian sat atop it, looking down from above at the numerous disciples. His gaze seemed to pause slightly when it swept past Ezra's location, before a deep voice sounded, "Since everyone is here, we will prepare to activate Energy Mountain and begin the training. Please wait, Elder Ian, I have something to say." However, a sharp voice followed Yin's. Every gaze on the mountain looked over, and saw a young man stand up, his vicious-looking eyes akin to a wolf's. "It's Peliok as expected, he's going after Ezra." The sights of this young man caused numerous whispers to explode as gloating gaze after gaze turned towards the werewolf prince. There was no change in Ezra's expression except that of his wicked smile. Ian glanced at Peliok and slowly asked, "What is the matter?" Disdain lifted from the corners of Pelium's mouth as he looked towards Ezra, cupped his fists together and said, "I want to challenge senior brother Ezra Zephyr, because I feel that he is not worthy of being a first-class disciple." According to the rules of the spirit-devouring mountain, disciples had to defer to each other based on their rank, irregardless of age. Ezra was currently a first-class disciple, hence why Peliok had to call him senior brother. Peliok's words caused a wave of noise to erupt. Several individuals that were jealous of Ezra nodded in agreement. XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, and the rest of the Naren geniuses did not look too good, their expressions both tensed and worried. Near the peak, Drake Tubble and numerous other first-class disciples merely watched with the detached eyes of a bystander, the sense of superiority in the expressions unconcealable. Ravina felt a little pity as she shot a look at Ezra. After today, he would become the shortest-lived first-class disciple in the history of this sect. In the air, Yin's expression remained unchanged as he nonchalantly said, "In a challenge between disciples, both parties must be willing. As long as Ezra Zephyr agrees, you may naturally proceed." He then looked towards the prince and said, "Will you accept Peliok's challenge? If you lose, your first-class disciple status will be stripped." Every gaze looked towards man in black long coat. There was neither fear nor alarm on his face as he calmly said, "Does that mean I can decline?" These words immediately gave rise to numerous hisses of displease, disdain emerging in the gazes that looked towards him. A weakling that avoided battle was even more looked down upon. Ravina shook her head, the earlier pity instantly vanishing into thin air. A person may be weak, but if one's character was weak and submissive, one was not even deserving of pity. Yin softly chuckled. "Does that mean that you're going to decline?" If Ezra really declined, his reputation would become terrible. He smiled. "Elder Yin misunderstands. I merely want to know whether I am allowed to decline." Yin frowned at Ezra's cunningness, unable to understand Ezra's goal. The prince ignored the former, his gaze shifting to Peliok instead as he said, "You've heard it. I have the right to decline. However, I can give you a chance to challenge me, but you must first pay me 30 spirit jade pieces." The entire mountain fell silent, dumbstruck gaze after gaze staring at Ezra. No one had expected him to propose such a condition. This would totally catch anyone off guard. There was no change in Ezra in response to these gazes. If he lost, he would lose his status as a first-class disciple, but if Peliok lost, he wouldn't really lose anything. This was obviously way too unfair. Hence, he needed to tell everyone that if you want to challenge him, you'll have to pay the challenge price. If he didn't do that, anyone would challenge him when they had nothing better to do. Did they believe he was too free? Peliok's face turned black as he said through gnashed teeth, 30 spirit jade pieces? You must be crazy. Are you afraid of losing? Ezra grinned. A first-class disciple status and 30 spirit jade pieces, you should know which has more value, right? The corners of Peliok's mouth twitched. In the end, a vicious and resolute look flashed in his eyes. "Fine, I agree." Peliok viciously glared at Ezra. The former had already decided that he would not show any mercy at all. He would make it such that this country bumpkin from this Naren continent would not enjoy spending his money. It was clear that Peliok did not believe the first-level core formation stage Ezra Zephyr had any chance at victory. "Since you've paid, I will definitely satisfy you." Upon seeing Peliok agree, Ezra's expression turned cold. He stood up, slivers of iciness flowing in his eyes as he looked towards the former, and everyone saw an astonishing black lightning infused with reddish lesser bolts slowly flickered from his body. "Come." A frosty voice sounded from his mouth. When Ezra stood up on the prowess platform, everyone felt something different about his aura. Several of the sharper disciples narrowed their eyes slightly in amazement. From his aura, they could tell that Ezra had experienced numerous battles. Because only through continuous battle would such an aura appear. Unfortunately, he is still only a first-level practitioner. Several individuals secretly shook their heads. The gap between these two was just far too great. No mercy could be seen in Peliok's eyes as he gazed at Ezra. Maliciousness soon began to appear from the corners of the former's mouth as robust chi rapidly erupted from his body like a volcano. The surging chi stirred the wind and clouds, the power of a second-level core formation undoubtedly on full display. The expressions of numerous third-class disciples changed slightly when they felt the overbearing spiritual energy pressure. Although Peliok was vicious, he was indeed rather capable. On a certain cultivation platform near the peak, one of the first-class disciples turned to his side and asked Drake. "Hey Drake, who do you think will win?" Drake wore an uncaring expression, his eyelids lowering slightly, showing that he had no interest at all in watching such a fight. He offhandedly answered, "Although Peliok is only average amongst the Shurian continent's younger generation, it will be easy for him to deal with a first-level core formation. There's nothing worth watching in such a battle." The first-class disciple was amused. Does this mean Ezra was planning to extort those 30 spirit jade pieces as compensation? Drake nonchalantly said, "I don't care about such unimportant things." From what he could see, neither Peliok nor Ezra was worthy of his attention. To him, it was merely a little squabble. Some distance away, Ravina had a hand on her chin, now a little interested after seeing the change in Ezra's aura. Could he have some ability? Under countless watching eyes, the chi around Peliok roared. A split second later, his foot slammed into the ground, cracking it as his body transformed into a blur that headed straight towards Ezra Zephyr. Spiritual energy rapidly swirled around his body like a storm, and even the air was blasted away from his feet. "A single move shall send you tumbling down." Ferocity flooded Peliok's eyes as his 5 fingers tightly clenched into a fist. The chi in his body surged out without reservation, his ferocious aura causing the expressions of even some of the first and second-class disciples to change. Peliok was clearly holding nothing back. Ezra stood on his prowess platform and watched as a figure rapidly grew in his eyes. Violent spiritual energy shock waves had already begun to pounce towards him like sharp blades. As expected, a second-level core formation expert. The expression on Ezra's youthful face remained unchanged. He giggled softly as he mumbled, "Back then in the Spirity Tower's last floor in Spirity Bailiwick, I had to use every trump card in my arsenal to kill that first-level core formation expert. That monster would have wiped the floor with all these so-called geniuses here. Yet, look at this idiot. Haha, marching at me, who killed that monster?" Iciness appeared in his eyes. Ezra's fingers instantly clenched into a fist, as the chaos lightning in his core erupted with a loud rumble. Scales extended from his fist, practically covering his entire arm. These scales were of purple color, the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom activated dragon pelt. Berserk power that slightly alarmed Ezra wildly churned inside his body. Golden pelt reached new heights after Ezra's boost, despite the fact it was in lowest stage. Everyone watched as black and red lightning dash into the sky from the top of Ezra's head, seemingly taking the shape of a wolf. Crackle crackle. The thundering black lightning enveloped Ezra's body. He suddenly moved, taking a step forward under the innumerable watching gazes. Bong. The air exploded, a sonic boom left in the dust behind Ezra. His figure disappeared the moment his foot touched the ground. Almost immediately after, everyone's pupils shrank when they saw Ezra's figure appear in midair halfway down the mountain. Wings made of lightning spiritual energy appeared at his back. He was now only a few feet from Peliok. Such speed! Cries of astonishment rose one after another. Everyone had jumped back a little at Ezra's sudden burst of speed. "You're merely at first level, stop putting up an act." With a shout, Peliok's expression twisted as the spiritual energy in his body circulated. Tiger roar, bash. A punch was sent flying, vigorous chi faintly forming the silhouette of a giant tiger. The deafening roar of a tiger followed, intimidating and threatening anyone who heard it. The roaring giant tiger was reflected in Ezra's eyes as he lightly expelled a breath of air. With a thought, the chaos lightning descended, the terrifying bolts reaching out and superimposing with Ezra Zephyr's scaly fist. In that moment, the space around him shook faintly. Ezra's face remained impassive as a punch was sent blasting forward. Under the attention of countless eyes, it powerfully slammed into Peliok's ferocious fist. It was a simple punch, but it contained all of the golden pelt scales and Ezra's physical power. Boom. A shockwave that could be seen with the naked eye violently pulsed outwards. In the air, Elder Yin's pupils suddenly tightened while he was observing their clash. Every gaze in the mountain was tinged with shock as they looked towards the epicenter of the clash, where Ezra's fist was effortlessly piercing through. Bong! The roaring giant tiger was instantly ripped apart in a barbaric manner. A berserk, chaotic lightning thundered. Disbelief flooded out in Peliok's eyes. He could feel an indescribably overwhelming power surge towards him in an unstoppable manner, forcibly ripping through all of his power in the most tyrannical way. His second-level core formation stage power was unable to put up even the slightest resistance. He involuntarily cried out in horror, "How is this possible?" Boom! The air was violently blasted away as a fist covered in purplish scales gracefully pierced all of his defenses and landed on his chest. Thump! A muffled sound rang out as Peliok's chest seemed to cave in. His body was instantly sent flying, like a rolling bottle gourd, as he tumbled like a rag doll from the waist of the mountain to its foot. The entire mountain was silent. Shocked gaze after gaze looked towards the sky where Ezra Zephyr was still in a punching posture. The expression in Ezra's eyes was unchanged as he looked towards the foot of the mountain where Peliok had been blasted to. "Now one punch is enough for a second level," he said with a wicked smirk. On the now silent energy mountain, Drake Tubble's lightly shut eyes trembled slightly as they finally opened. A sliver of astonishment flowed on Ravina Ingale's pretty face. The others were wide-eyed. No one had expected the second-level core formation expert Peliok to be incapable of withstanding even a single punch from Ezra Zephyr. They had originally believed that it would be a fierce fight. Instead, it was as if the battle had ended before it had even started. The enormous energy mountain was blanketed in silence. Numerous gazes were fixed on a certain spot in the air, where Ezra was still in his punching posture. The purplish scales on the latter's arms began to recede. There was no change in his smirk from start to end, as if the stunning punch earlier did not have anything to do with him. The silence lasted for a rather long time before it was gradually broken. Levo swallowed multiple times, a trace of fear now present in his eyes when he looked towards Ezra. Although he was also at the second-level core formation stage, his battle power was weaker than Peliok's. And yet, Peliok had been crushed by a single punch from the man he mocked a day before. "This is too frightening," he mumbled, still unable to believe what had just happened. He truly could not imagine that the Peliok would not be able to withstand even a single punch from Ezra Zephyr. Peliok was a Shurian genius after all. Although he was only considered average, he was already stronger than many others. Even so, his defeat at Ezra Zephyr's hands had been far too clean. From this, one could see how overwhelming the Werewolf Prince's battle power was. Levo grinned. He had previously felt that it was rather regretful that Peliok had managed to take the lead on them, but now, Levo was pretty glad for that. Or else, the one who was sent to the foot on the mountain with a single punch would likely be himself. "Haha, His Majesty is as fierce here as he was when we conquered Warborn and Tribban kingdoms." After a brief period of shock, Argus Waska burst into laughter and said in a loud voice. His voice resounded in the mountain. All other Naren continent's geniuses were filled with abundance of glee. They felt honored by Ezra's achievement. Especially when they felt the now no longer present contempt in the gazes of the other disciples. "Let's see who else dares to say our Naren continent geniuses are useless." The one who said that was Tsunzun. Although there had been a tussle between him and Ezra in the auction, at the end of the day, they were both from the same Naren continent. Any setbacks Ezra faced would not be good news to him either. Near the peak of Energy Mountain, one of the Shurian first-class disciples laughed as he remarked, "Hee, so he does have some skills." His gaze contained hints of a toying sensation when he looked towards Ezra. Peliok turns out to be rather disappointing. This was the evaluation of the Shurian and Ryan first-class disciples, clearly extremely displeased with Peliok's performance. After all, Peliok had been defeated by a genius from some remote continent, a fact that would undoubtedly affect the superior status of these two strong continents' geniuses. One of the first-class disciples looked towards Drake and asked with a smile, "Drake, what's your opinion?" He nonchalantly glanced at Ezra's figure before withdrawing his gaze. "He's not bad." The martial spirit he has is likely a 6th grade, which is pretty rare. Such a high-level spirit almost never seen in these remote continents. It seems that he had a fortunate encounter. However, his cultivation is too low. The previous punch may seem simple, but it contained the majority of his power. Any of you would have been able to block it. All in all, he's only a small threat, so there's no need to make a fuss about it. Upon hearing Drake's evaluation, the other Shurian and Ryan first-class disciples chuckled. In contrast to the shock the other disciples felt, their insight was much better and would naturally not react so drastically to Ezra Zephyr's punch. However, the contempt they had towards Ezra previously had now waned slightly. As top continent's disciples, they naturally had an air of superiority towards the disciples from the other continents. Ravina's eyes contained a sliver of interest as she stared at the prince. It seems that they had been wrong. Ezra Zephyr may look like a first level on the surface, but his true battle power was pretty much off the charts. Looks like his first-class disciple status was not fully due to pulling strings, mumbled Ravina to herself, before she slowly withdrew her gaze. Ezra's earlier performance could be said to be perfect. However, it at most made her feel slightly amazed. The complete and utter shock the other disciples felt was evidently not too probably with her. Under the various gazes all over the mountain, Ezra slowly pulled back his fist. He gazed at the sorry figure that had tumbled to the bottom of the mountain and suddenly shook his sleeve. A bolt of black lightning shot out, lifting a cloth bag from Peliok's body. A tinkling sound was heard as the cloth bag swayed. It was the sound of spirit jade pieces. SWIISSH. However, just as Ezra was about to retrieve the bag, a stream of mana shot over, grabbing the other end of the bag. Ezra's eyes widened slightly as he lifted his head, only to see a young man in scarlet robes indifferently looking at him from one of the cultivation platforms near the peak, the latter's scattered hair hanging behind him. My fellow disciple, since you've already won, there's no need to be so overbearing, right? The young man in scarlet robes revealed a faint smile. Numerous gazes looked towards him, whispers immediately rising. It's Moshi. I knew he would do something. I heard that he and Peliok are very close, but most importantly, he is also a Shurian disciple. Ezra Zephyr gazed at the young man in scarlet robes and chuckled. I am only retrieving what should be mine, that's not overbearing, right? The eyes of the young man narrowed slightly. Peliok was indeed reckless earlier, but you've already taught him a lesson. Will you leave these spirit jade pieces behind on my account? Although his tone was calm, there was no room for discussion, as if the matter had already been decided. If fellow disciple had stepped forward earlier, today's matter would not have happened, said Ezra Zephyr. As for now, I'm afraid that it's already too late. Ezra's eyes hardened as he flicked his finger. The bolt of chaos lightning instantly tore open the cloth bag. With a wave of his sleeve, another red bolt of chaos force snaked out and caught all the falling spirit jade pieces before returning to him. If he had lost today, Moshi would not have spoken up for him. Hence, he would naturally not show any courtesy to such a biased person. You. Upon seeing Ezra directly snatch away the spirit jade pieces, an act that clearly gave no face, Moshi's eyes also hardened, iciness appearing in his gaze when he looked at Ezra Zephyr. What an arrogant rascal. Moshi smiled in anger. Do you really dare to step over all our Shurian and Ryan disciples' heads? Moshi's words were malicious, instantly pitting Ezra Zephyr against every disciple of the two continents, evidently planning on making him face the fury of the crowd. Some disciples seemed to look over. They were naturally not feeling too good about Peliok's miserably defeat, and it was difficult to avoid having opinions about the one who had beaten him. Haha, there seems to be a mistake in Brother Moshi's words. Before the challenge, Peliok had already agreed to the terms, which every disciple here clearly heard. It is only reasonable for Brother Ezra Zephyr to retrieve his spoils of battle, so why the need to be so overbearing? A voice sounded all of a sudden. Unexpectedly, however, it was speaking up for Ezra Zephyr. The prince was somewhat surprised. He turned his head, and found that the one who had spoken was a faintly smiling thin young man. Ezra had a faint impression of the former. He was also a first-class disciple, and should be called Ashbeckham. He too was not from the Shurian or Ryan continent, and was hence pretty popular amongst many non-Shurian and Ryan disciples, making him a celebrity of sorts. After Ezra had displayed his strength, the opinion that he was someone who went through the back door had changed, and there were now people who were willing to show friendly gestures to him, though he honestly did not mind either way. Due to his popularity, Ashbeckham's words drew a series of verbal support from the non-Shurian and Ryan disciples. Moshi glared at Ashbeckham when he saw this, but he knew that there was no longer anything he could do to Ezra Zephyr today. Hence, Moshi frostily glanced at Ezra, before retrieving his gaze. However, anyone could see that the former was not going to forget this. The prince paid no attention to Moshi's gaze, instead turning his head slightly to look at Ashbeckham, causing the latter to display a friendly smile. Since it was not appropriate for him to be too cold, Ezra nodded in response. Subsequently, his gaze swept across the area as he coolly asked, "Is there anyone else who wants to challenge me?" The entire mountain was silent. Which one of the second-class disciples would dare to respond after witnessing Peliok's miserable fate? On the other hand, the first-class disciples merely watched like bystanders. Thus, no one responded to Ezra Zephyr. Upon seeing this, he returned to his prowess platform and lifted his head towards Een, who was seated in midair. "Elder Een, may we begin the Energy Mountain training?" Only at this moment did Een return to his senses. He deeply looked at Ezra Zephyr, evidently not expecting such an outcome. No wonder Xavier was not worried about Ezra's first-class disciple status being stolen in the blink of an eye. It turns out that this kid was not as simple as he seemed. However, this kid likely did not know that defeating Peliok would end up offending the Shurian disciples. There would only be more and more scuffled in the future. Een wondered if Ezra would still be so cool and collected then. His gazes flickered in thought for a moment before withdrawing it. His gaze then swept across the over 10,000 prowess platforms on Energy Mountain as his calm voice sounded. "Activate Energy Mountain." "Wait, Elder Een!" someone cried. Een was irritated. "What is it?" A youth bowed respectfully and said, "I am a second-class disciple and I want to challenge a first-class disciple." Silence befell on the mountain. Who would have thought that another maniac would target Ezra? Een felt joy bursting in his heart. He smiled and asked, "Who do you want to challenge?" That man answered in an angry tone. "Senior brother Moshi of Shurian continent." Hearing that, Moshi flinched, not in fear but in shock. How dare someone challenge him, he thought. Yin's eyes widened. He looked at that man and questioned, "Who are you?" The man wore a straw hat. He raised from his bowing position and replied, "Second-class disciple, XYR of Naren continent." Een gasped. He turned his head to see Ezra, who winked at him and giggled. "Naren continent. He is from this continent like Ezra Zephyr. Isn't he aware that Moshi is at third-level core formation stage? He is different than Peliok." Een threw another question. "Why do you want to challenge him?" An uproar arose on the mountain. "You dare to disrespect your senior brother?" yelled Een. At that time, Ezra Zephyr spoke up. "Elder Een, why are you being so biased? These same words were said to me by Peliok, yet you didn't say anything to him. Then why so furious on our Naren continent? This continent is the home of spirit-devouring mountain. Even as an elder, you should be giving it some respect." His words carried an undefeated charm and unflinching charisma. All non-Shurian and Ryan geniuses were moved by his words and daring, including Ashbeckham. "Elder Een!" Another yell. Een stared in the direction of a bulky youngster was there. "Second class, Argus of Naren continent wants to challenge senior brother Galabi of Shurian continent." Second class, Zulfi of Naren continent wants to challenge senior sister Naranji of Shurian continent. Second class, Shifa of Naren continent wants to challenge senior brother. Third class, Thur of Naren wants to challenge. Third class, Gil of Naren wants to challenge. Every single one of the Naren continent challenged the geniuses of the Shurian continent. Only 5 challenged them for first-class disciple quota. XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Argus Waska, Shifa Pista, and Urgale Arms. The rest eyed on the quota of second class. Sinzutun was hesitating, but after getting a reward from Ezra Zephyr, he also got a burning patriotism for his continent and cried out. Third-class disciple, Sinzutun wants to challenge senior brother Viscut of Shurian continent. Seeing their sheer power, those other geniuses who were silent because of fear started to shout as well. Second-class disciple, Mocha of Chadar continent wants to challenge senior sister Dari of Ryan continent. Eldarine blinked in bewilderment. In the history of Energy Mountain, the such thing had never happened. The geniuses of Shurian and Ryan, do you have the balls to accept Naren's challenge? If yes, then accept the damn challenges. Ezra Zephyr roared, black and red chaotic lightning thundered as he said. His dominance shook the mountain, Een almost skipped a beat. Everyone's eyes widened, they gazed at their geniuses, Drake Tubble and Ravina Ingale. However, unlike the rest, they both were smiling for some reason. I accept his request. The first to reply was Moshi. Eldarine, I accept. Yes, I accept. One by one everyone accepted the request. There were around 700 challenges, out of which 400 challengers were from the Naren continent. Eldarine was baffled, and before he could think of anything, the challengers dashed toward their opponents. A war broke out on Energy Mountain. Hey, stop it! Eldarine yelled. Ezra chuckled. Eldarine, let them be. Let the weaks die, ha ha ha. This guy, he is a lunatic, curse you, Xavier. Mumbled Een. After a few hours, the battle ended. The result shocked the whole mountain, 80% of the total challengers succeeded. But they seemed a bit angry, not worried, because only 5 Shurian lost the first disciple quotas. The remaining were second-class disciples, who were considered trash of Shurian and Ryan. All of Bloodfang Kingdom's martial masters won their challenge and only a single one from Naren who was not from Bloodfang succeeded, he was Sinzutun. The non-Shurian and Ryan were celebrating when a loud sound came from the top of the mountain. Elder, we have wasted so much time. Activate the mountain. It was the voice of Drake Tubble, who was not affected by today's great upset. MHM, activate Energy Mountain. With a wave of his sleeve, a stream of spiritual energy fell into the volcano-like mouth at the peak, seemingly activating a certain imprint rune. BZZ. The surroundings immediately began to stir. Every disciple lifted their head in astonishment as they watched the surrounding energy flood towards Energy Mountain like a surging mist. The blooming spirit flower before them began to sway at this moment, absorbing the spiritual energy in Energy Mountain. In the end, its petals gradually opened as boundless spiritual energy spouted out along with innumerable golden pollen. On Energy Mountain, spiritual energy sprayed from 10,000 flowers, a scene that was spectacular and beautiful. Ezra also raised his head as anticipation appeared in his eyes. He was dying to see just how effective the legendary blooming spirit flower would be. Flower after flower swayed on the titanic Energy Mountain, golden light pulsing in circles. It made the flowers look as if they were made of gold, an exceedingly gorgeous sight indeed. A fragrance spread, filling the area. The roots of the flowers dug deep into the mountain, continuously absorbing the spiritual energy within. Golden flower after flower gradually blossomed, the petals suddenly erupting as boundless and pure energy sprayed out. Numerous golden pollen drifted within the pure energy, giving it a strange fragrance. Such pure spiritual energy. Amazement flitted across Thur's eyes, who just got his first-class quota, as he watched energy stream out of the blooming spirit flower. He could sense that this energy was purer than normal. Spiritual energy infused with golden pollen spread. Just as it was about to leave the prowess platform, the runes on the platform suddenly began to glow, transforming into a dome of light that sealed off the entire prowess platform. This prevented the golden pollen spiritual energy from drifting away. Thus, the golden pollen energy continued to accumulate, gradually engulfing the figures seated on the platforms. Every disciple hurriedly closed their eyes at this moment, swiftly entering a state of cultivation and meditation as they greedily devoured the golden pollen spiritual energy. Ezra likewise also shut his eyes, the chaos force lightning slowly beginning to stir. With thunder, the Fenrir opened his mouth and a suction force appeared around Ezra. The surrounding golden pollen energy was immediately drawn towards him, transforming into streams of gold as it rapidly flowed into Ezra's body through his nose. Golden pollen energy swam along his meridian channels and entered the core, before being swallowed by Fenrir within it. The golden pollen energy was swiftly refined, transforming into the force of Ezra's Zephyr. The thing that surprised even Ezra the most was that as the golden pollen spiritual energy was refined, he could feel a faint burning sensation flowing within his chaos lightning. Ezra could not help but exclaim in amazement in his heart, "This blooming spirit flower is amazing." The pollen-infused energy it produces can continuously concentrate one's energy while training, while also burning away the impurities within. It may not show much effect in the short term, but the cumulative results over time were pretty darn amazing. When two spiritual energy of similar grades clashed, the upper hand would go to the one that was more concentrated and robust. Hence, the flower would undoubtedly give the spirit-devouring mountain disciples an advantage. As expected of the sect that was once the strongest in Naran continent, Ezra could not stop praising. Regardless of whether it was the energy mountain he stood on or these blooming spirit flowers, unique methods were required to create them. Ordinary factions did not possess the qualifications to do so. By this point, Ezra was even more certain that only in the spirit-devouring mountain would he be able to truly dig out of all of his potentials. Only here would he reach the highest stage in the shortest time possible, and gain the power to match the uncountable enemies of the upper realm. Ezra's concentration gradually increased as he began to immerse himself in his training. While this happened, golden pollen energy continued to be spouted from the blooming spirit flower, making the cultivation platform grow even more dazzling. On another cultivation platform near to Ezra's, under the cover of golden light, XYR leisurely absorbed the floating golden pollen energy, with no desire to waste any at all. The other 4 Naran members did the same. Every prowess platform on the giant energy mountain was filled with golden light. The flickering golden light seemingly turned the entire mountain gold. Time gradually flowed, and 4 hours swiftly passed. After 4 hours, the spouting blooming spirit flower finally began to slow down as the glowing golden prowess platforms gradually dimmed. However, everyone was still immersed in enjoying the sweet benefits, and could not possibly be willing to stop. Several disciples immediately retrieved a piece of spirit jade and flung it towards the blooming spirit flower. The moment the spirit jade touched the flower, a crack split open on the flower, swallowing the spirit jade like a mouth. After swallowing the jade, the originally somewhat wilting flower began to shine dazzlingly as it began to energetically spout out more spiritual energy. Only now did the many disciples finally understand how precious the spirit jade was. As long as one had enough spirit jade, one would practically have an endlessly spouting blooming spirit flower, making one's cultivation speed faster than others. At this point, everyone could not help but feel some pity for Peliok, because he had already lost all of this month's spirit jade pieces. The prince opened his eyes, falling into thought for a brief second, before fishing out a spirit jade piece and feeding it to the blooming spirit flower. While training earlier, he had faintly felt the existence of the peak first level. Once he succeeded in sensing it, he would truly step into the second-level core formation stage. After eating the spirit jade piece, the flower once again began to tirelessly draw out the spiritual energy from the energy mountain. In the end, spiritual energy mixed with golden pollen covered the Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom's figure like a golden mist. With a single piece of spirit jade, the blooming spirit flower would be able to continue for another 2 hours. The werewolf prince's figure was just barely discernible in the golden pollen spiritual energy mist. His eyes were tightly shut, his consciousness seemingly drifting in the murkiness. Something deep down inside of him could feel a very faint sensation, while his core slowly followed this faint feeling. He did not know how long this continued, until a certain moment when his core seemed to bump into something. With a jolt, Ezra Zephyr's consciousness violently returned to his senses as the world before him rapidly changed. What appeared in his sights was a mysterious world that was filled with the aura of primal chaos. The aura seemed to stir, giving off a feeling of ancientness. What is this place? Ezra Zephyr trembled as he was struck with a flash of understanding. Then was this primal chaos-like aura the so-called altar of Heavenly Tribulation? Absorbing it would transform his chaos force and form a more solid core, allowing it to gradually evolve into a true and more powerful core formation expert. Joy flooded Ezra's heart. He knew that the moment his spirit entered this mysterious place, he had finally truly stepped into the epitome of this stage. Use the lightning to receive spiritual energy, and transform the vast spiritual energy into the core. Tiny wisps of what seemed to be the essence of the world drifted within the primal chaos-like space, giving off an ancient aura. With regards to the mysterious world essence like chi and mana, desire instinctively rose in Ezra Zephyr. His consciousness stood in this domain as his senses stretched forth. The domain seemed to be endless, making it impossible for him to find its boundaries. So this is the true core formation stage. Why didn't I feel this when I stepped into first level? Mumbled Ezra to himself. Only those that had stepped into the core formation stage would be able to sense the heavenly turbulence and enter the altar to absorb them. I guess I'll have to use my spiritual power to move the energy here back into my body to begin transforming my core. Evidently, the more powerful the turbulence, the greater one's advantage in the core formation. With powerful turbulence, solidifying the core would be more effective, allowing one to surpass others in this aspect. At this point, Ezra laughed softly. This just so happened to be his strong point. Amongst those at the same level, he rarely encountered anyone whose spiritual energy was as powerful as his own. With the exception of Carlo or, of course. After unsealing the first seal of the Dracal wolf family, Ezra's body had grown even more and was now perfect to hold an abundance of spiritual energy. All that was needed was an opportunity for him to smoothly store more in his core than the rest. Normally speaking, for those who did not practice any body tempering methods, when their martial prowess reached the core formation stage, their body would still strengthen. However, this boost was limited, and most would only reach a smaller level than those with body tampering methods. In comparison to Ezra's perfect golden pelt and strong bloodline, the distance between them was tremendous. Therefore, at the very least, Ezra's body would give him a huge advantage at the core formation level. With these thoughts in mind, Ezra decided not to waste any more time. His energy extended, seemingly transforming into numerous giant invisible hands that began to scoop up the tiny streams of world essence energy. Spiritual energy swirled around his body together with the now secured world essence energy, growing more abundant as wisp after wisp continued to be collected. After a period of several minutes, the flowing world essence energy around him had thickened to strands. By this time, all of the world's essence energy in the vicinity had already been collected. By now, the world essence energy swirling around Ezra Zephyr's spirit was akin to tiny twisters, a pretty impressive sight indeed. Ezra nodded as he gazed upon the fruits of his hard work in satisfaction. With a thought, his spiritual energy began to leave the altar of Heavenly Tribulation. The invisible suction force herded the world's essence energy towards the pole of the physical body. At this current moment, the shining golden light on the numerous prowess platforms had already gradually dimmed. Stalk after stalk of blooming spirit flower drew back their leaves and petals, the golden glow they previously gave off now much duller, a sign that they had used up all their energy. The many disciples sat on the prowess platforms, their faces overflowing with joy. The training session had benefited them substantially, and most importantly, they had finally truly tasted the wonderfulness of entering the spirit-devouring mountain. The outside world was definitely unable to provide such a unique training method because ordinary sects completely lacked the means. Argus stretched his back, boldly displaying the amazing muscles of his wide body that drew several barely detectable glances. As a first-class disciples, the Naren continent geniuses' fame and reputation amongst the new disciples were even greater than Shurien and Ryan's. After the huge upset they caused by defeating so many of the geniuses of Shurien and Ryan, Many were already secretly trying to find out more information about them since yesterday. After all of them were powerful. In addition, their loyalty and respect towards Ezra Zephyr caught their eyes, and they were in wonder about Ezra's background. Only those first-class disciples of the same status with ability worth bragging about would dare to talk with them. However, they chose to completely ignore these gazes. They looked towards Ezra's prowess platform. XYR had sensed some strange activity from Ezra's body. This master has entered the Tribulence Altar? Has he finally stepped into the second-level core formation stage? The Jinn was somewhat surprised. Crackle. The moment XYR's words faded, a strange thunder suddenly sounded in the sky. Numerous disciples lifted their heads in bewilderment, only to watch in astonishment as white lightning bolts of world essence energy began slashing down from high up the sky like a whip. This is Heavenly Tribulence? The sight of the world's essence energy caused numerous disciples to cry out in surprise. Someone has just break through and called Heavenly Tribulence? Everyone was somewhat stunned. The scene before their eyes was very familiar. It occurred when someone reached the core formation stage, linked to the Heavenly Tribulence altar and brought back world essence energy. In other words, someone had ascended to a new level of the core formation stage, a solid foundation. However, there was someone who had yet to call the Heavenly Tribulence amongst them. It's Ezra Zephyr. Someone quickly regained his wits. Surprised gaze after gaze was cast in Ezra's direction. Sure enough, they saw that his eyes were still closed, the world's essence energy slashing down from the sky and landing on his body as it flashed in. He's already caused such a ruckus at the first-level core formation stage. Wouldn't that mean he'll be going to turn the world upside down after he steps into the second level and absorbs the turbulence? Several Shurian first-class disciples could not help but cheekily joke when they saw this. In between their words were mockery and arrogance. One of the first-class disciples smiled as he asked Drake Tubble, "Drake, when you called Heavenly Tribulence, how many Heavenly Tribulence thunderbolts you brought back last?" Drake's face was impassive as he answered, 935 bolts. This period of time started when the turbulence first appeared and ended when all of it entered the core. It would normally be over pretty quickly and was hence counted in bolts. Awesome! Praised the other first-class disciples when they heard Drake Tubble's answer as their faces lit up with admiration. The first time I brought back Heavenly Tribulence thunderbolts, it only lasted for 400 bolts. Me too. Looks like Brother Drake's body is pretty strong too. Drake chuckled softly. I had a fortunate encounter in the past, and my body just happened to reach the new stage when I ascended to the core formation stage. No wonder. The crowd nodded. Most of them were only at the normal body stage and naturally could not compare to Drake Tubble. Hee, I wonder how long the Heavenly Tribulence thunderbolts Ezra Zephyr brought back will last. They grinned as they looked towards Ezra Zephyr as if something amusing was going to happen. Ezra's victory over Peliok had in a certain manner made the Shurian and Ryan disciples lose face, followed by 500 plus more defeats. Hence, they were naturally keen on gloating over him. While the crowd was whispering, Ravina in Gale also looked over. The first time she had brought back Heavenly Tribulence thunderbolts, it had lasted 1,000 breaths, a record even longer than Drake's. Hence, she too was interested to find out what the one who had overwhelmed Peliok could achieve. In the Energy Mountain, everyone was waiting to see the number of bolts. Besides the rest, even Ash Beckham and the other non-Shurian and Ryan disciples, who had spoken up for Ezra Zephyr earlier, also cast their gazes over. In mid-air, Eldarine also turned his attention towards Ezra Zephyr. Under the numerous watching gazes, Ezra's eyes remained shut as the world essence energy continued to descend. Time swiftly passed with thunderous noises. World essence energy seemed to have been squeezed out of some unknown domain, appearing in the sky above Ezra Zephyr, before endlessly falling onto him in the form of white lightning. Under the attention of countless gazes, time swiftly flowed. 100 bolts faded away in an instant. Every gaze was unblinking as they continued to count the bolts. 100 bolts, 150 bolts, 200 bolts. It soon reached 300 bolts. However, the descending lightning of world essence was still as clear and bountiful as before, showing no signs of waning. 400 bolts, 500 bolts. By this time, the expressions of the first-class Shurian and Ryan disciples had turned a little ugly. This timing had already surpassed their own. They could not help but sourly remark, "He does have the talent." Only Drake remained impassive, not even the slightest ripple visible on his face. World essence energy continued to fall as time continued to flow. It soon reached 700 bolts. Low cries of surprise began to ring out in the mountain. This timing had already surpassed 90% of the people here, and even some first-class disciples would be left far behind in the dust by this number. "I can't believe his body tempering is so high," said Levo in amazement. Lasting this long was clearly out of his expectations. Drake Tubble frowned slightly. This guy. He had detected that even at 700 bolts, the heavenly turbulence that descended from the sky still showed no signs of stopping. It looked as if the reserves were still ample. 750 bolts, 800 bolts. 1,000 bolts. The entire energy mountain had fell deathly silent. The Shurian first-class disciples swallowed their saliva and looked towards Drake, seeing the latter's brows now tightly furrowed together. Ezra had already surpassed his record. The thing that made Drake's expression sink the most was that even at 1,000 bolts, the falling lightning of world essence still showed no indications of weakening. Several of the first-class disciples could not help but blurt out, "Just how strong is his body? How can he bring back so much heavenly turbulence at core formation stage on his first time?" Drake Tubble's gaze flickered for a moment. He stared deeply at Ezra Zephyr and indifferently said, "Interesting." "How amazing." Ravina Ingale's eyes also glimmered faintly, her voice filled with interest. She had realized that she could no longer estimate the extent of his abilities. The young man who had originally been nothing special in her eyes now seemed a little unfathomable. As soft gasps sounded across the mountain, the heavenly turbulence continued to fall, lasting all the way till 2,179 bolts under everyone's stunned gazes. Numerous disciples looked to each other, not knowing what to say. Even now, the heavenly turbulence they could bring back was far from being able to match this number. And yet, Ezra Zephyr had achieved it despite being from a remote continent, who was merely famous for 7 sex. Although this did not determine one's future accomplishments, it would at least give Ezra Zephyr the absolute advantage during the core formation stage. A single round for him would be equivalent to several rounds for them. How could they match his efficiency? Drake Tubble let out a long breath, his eyes turning as deep as the night. He looked towards the stunned Shurian disciples in the vicinity and said in a nonchalant voice, "No need to make a mountain out of a molehill. His body is likely stronger than ours because he practices a body tempering method. I'll admit that he does have ambition, training both spiritual energy and body. Though ambition is good, one should only do what's within one's capabilities. Dual cultivation would result in having to split one's efforts and attention, making him unable to be as focused as us. Therefore, when the time comes where we step into the foundation establishment stage, he will likely still be struggling at the core formation stage. Likewise, how long he lasted against heavenly turbulence doesn't mean anything, because the most important factor is still how many spiritual energy gobs he managed to create. The true representation of one's foundations." The other disciples nodded in agreement after hearing this. It was indeed as he had said, dual cultivation might give one the ability to utilize multiple strategies, but it also meant difficulty in achieving proficiency in both. Thus, it may be better to focus on one like themselves. At the very least, if they could reach the foundation establishment stage, though their bodies would not be as strong as Ezra's, they would still be able to easily finish him off in a fight. As for the spiritual energy gobs, they were tiny specks of light created from the amalgamation of spiritual energy and heavenly turbulence, and looked similar to shapeless gobs. Hence why they were called spiritual energy stars. Someone asked, "How many spiritual energy gobs did Senior Brother Drake create on your first try?" "I believe I managed slightly over 20. I only had a little more than 50. Drake smiled faintly. The others once again secretly wet their lips. Having over 50 gobs after reaching the core formation stage was enough to show the abundance of Drake Tubble's spiritual energy. Ravina in Gale's gaze concentrated on the Prince of Werewolves. She too understood that although how long the Heavenly Tribulation lasted showed the strength of his body, the most important thing to the core formation stage was the number of spiritual energy gobs. I made 63 back then, I wonder how many Ezra Zephyr will create, she mumbled. While the entire mountain was in shock due to the prince, the person himself was completely unaware, because he was currently viewing the interior of his body's core. As the robust amount of spiritual energy flowed into his thundering core, enormous changes began to appear. Ezra's core had originally given off a black-red luster, but as more and more World SM's energy entered, the core gradually began to expand, growing even larger. Faint ancient patterns began to appear. Ezra Zephyr could clearly feel the World Essence energy enlarged his core, allowing for more spiritual energy to be stored. In addition, when the World Essence energy began to mix with the spiritual energy within, a strange but wonderful mist began to rise, condensing into small specks of light that seemed akin to shapeless gobs, inside the core. These light gobs were filled with pure spiritual energy, while a barely discernible black wolf-like mark could be seen on each one. Is this the mark of the Fenrir? Spiritual energy gobs? Ezra carefully absorbed the shapeless gobs. These spiritual energy gobs symbolize the core formation stage and were extremely useful. In battle, the spiritual energy from detonating these spiritual energy gobs would possess even more explosive and destructive power than usual. Spiritual energy transforming into spiritual energy gobs was undoubtedly an evolution of sorts. The prince mumbled in his heart, it said that Foundation establishment experts have a whole world made from spiritual energy in their core, which is populated by millions of gobs. In a fight, they can turn the gobs into spiritual energy at any time at a far more effective rate than any core formation expert. At this point in time, 156 spiritual energy gobs had been created in his core. I've heard that the greater the number of gobs at the 7th level core formation stage, the higher quality the Foundation formed. Ezra was eager to find out how many spiritual energy gobs he would have when he'll advance to Foundation establishment stage. With such thoughts in mind, he once again looked towards the gobs in his core, before withdrawing from his state of prowess. On the prowess platform, Ezra's tightly shut eyes finally opened, immediately feeling the countless gazes on his body. Hey! A clear voice sounded. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom raised his head, and saw Ravina in Gale staring at him with bright eyes as she directly asked, "How many spiritual energy gobs do you have?" When Ravina's clear voice sounded, various emotions appeared within the countless gazes that were currently focused on Ezra. The amount of World Essence energy Ezra brought back was something to be envious about. However, the amount only showed that Ezra's body tempering was high. The most important thing to the core formation stage was still the number of spiritual energy gobs. From a certain point of view, it represented the amount of spiritual energy one had. Of course, this did not mean that the more gobs, the more powerful someone would be. There were still various other factors to consider, such as the grade of these spiritual energy gobs, and etc. Even so, at the end of the day, having more gobs would give one an advantage. Ezra was slightly taken aback by Ravina's directness. Soon after, he shook his head and said, "No comment." The number of gobs was a rather personal thing, and would allow another party to estimate one's strength. Although Ezra Zephyr did not really mind, he felt that there was really no benefit to revealing it here besides maybe causing some eyeballs to pop out of their sockets. Therefore, he cleanly rejected. Ezra's words immediately caused a series of noises indicating displeasure. "So arrogant, aren't you?" Ravina's eyes widened slightly, somewhat peeved as she glared at Ezra Zephyr. Given her status, she was seldom rejected by those of the opposite sex. "TCH, it seems that he's too ashamed to tell us." Several of Ravina in Gale's admirers sneered. "Yeah, he likely doesn't dare to say it. After all, he had brought back so much World Essence energy earlier and probably wasted it all. What a pity." Others began to chime in. They clearly believed Ezra's reluctance to answer was due to a lack of confidence. However, the prince's expression remained calm in the face of their words. If anyone wants to know how many gobs I have, won't you find out once you challenge me? The numerous disciples froze, before cursing out loud. Everyone present knew that you would have to pay 30 spirit jade pieces per challenge. The price was far too high. Hence, they could only inwardly shake their heads. After seeing Ezra's battle prowess earlier, they no longer dared to underestimate this first-class disciple who seemed the easiest to bully on the surface. Most importantly, Ezra was now even stronger than before, because he had now also stepped into the second-level core formation stage. Ezra was a little disappointed that no one was interested. It seems that plan of winning spirit jade crystals using this method was not going to work after the first time. These people won't fall for the same trick twice. As for the first-class disciples, they were unlikely to act before getting a proper grasp of his abilities. Ravina gritted her pearly white teeth. In the end, she could only glare at the Prince of Werewolves. Although she was curious about how many spiritual energy gobs Ezra Zephyr had, there was no grudge between them, and thus no reason for her to challenge him. Is he using this method to attract my attention? Ravina in Gale blinked a few times. There were after all too many young men who adored her, amongst which were no lack of individuals that tried various methods to catch her eye. In the air, Eldarine looked down from above, his indifferent gaze sweeping across Ezra Zephyr before shifting towards the numerous disciples as he said, "Today's training session shall end here. In the future, all of you will need to train in Energy Mountain every day." With regards to this, everyone nodded in approval. Energy Mountain was just too effective, and after personally experiencing its wonders, they were naturally dying to train in it every day. In the sky, Eldarine continued. Although martial prowess is important, do not neglect your spells and skills. You may head to the Outer Mountains, Mystic Demon Library, to rent sorcery spells and cultivation skills. However, the higher tier spells and skills will cost more to borrow. Of course, everything will be paid in spirit jade. There are also many instructors in the Mystic Demon Library whom you may approach if you're having any difficulties with learning the spells or skills you've selected. Similarly, this service will require spirit jade, and the better the instructor, the higher the cost. Yin's words made the heads of the numerous disciples swim. Why was spirit jade needed for everything? They had originally not thought much about the spirit jade, but today, its importance had been deeply carved into them. Without spirit jade, even the time they could use on the blooming spirit flower would be less than others. It seemed that 30 spirit jade pieces per month were really not enough. Every martial master is different to another. They can be either a sorcerer or a cultivator, rarity like Ezra Zephyr who could use both or XYR who has 2 martial spirits comes in 1,000 years. Apart from that, every martial master has a different build and attribute. One with water attribute martial spirit cannot learn earth attributed spells or skills. At the sight of the pained faces of the crowd, Eldarine instantly knew what they were worrying about. Hence, he continued to speak, as for spirit jade, besides the 30 given to you guys every month, you may earn more by completing various tasks from the task pavilion. They give out all kinds of missions such as patrolling, night watch duty, hunting various martial animals, searching for resources, and many others. As long as you complete such tasks, you will receive spirit jade as a reward. Only after hearing this did everyone breathe a sigh of relief. So there was another method to obtain spirit jade. If not, their days would have to be spent very frugally. Ezra Zephyr's eyes brightened. He was not interested in going to the task pavilion to take on any assignments for the time being. After all, he had won 30 spirit jade pieces from Peliok. Therefore, he was more interested in the Outer Mountains Mystic Demon Library. Although it was the Outer Mountains, it was still the spirit-devouring mountain, and the skills and spells found within should not be too low grade, right? Amongst the spiritual techniques I have, only the glittering wind and light is at the gamma level, and even then, it just barely makes the cut. All the other spiritual techniques have somewhat fallen behind my prowess, including Chains of Chaos, mumbled Ezra Zephyr to himself. As his strength rose, there was less and less use for the previous spiritual techniques he had learnt. In fact, he had been mostly relying on the dragon pelt and his martial art during the fight with Carlo or. He could use Fenrir's blessing to call the two powerful martial animals, but he cannot use it openly as it will cause a huge uproar and he might get hunted by spirit-devouring mountain's upper masters. Hence, he urgently needed a few little heaven-tier spiritual techniques to bolster his arsenal. Unfortunately, techniques at this level were difficult to come by, which could be seen in how hard martial masters had to work in order to obtain a single glittering wind and light skill. Boy. The voice, which remained silent for long, resounded in Ezra's mind. Fenrir, you are alive, huh? Mocked Ezra. Boy, if I die, you'll be as good as me. Replied Fenrir as he continued. You can evolve the chains of chaos, you made it your own. Thus, it can be improved by you. As for the spiritual techniques, I gave you the strongest one, the wheel of emotions. If you learned that, no one will be able to oppose you. It's a full set of different spiritual techniques. But, I still have yet to learn it. I had warned you, it is much more to be called difficult. But, you can get some good ones in Mystic Demon Library. For the time being, that would be useful for you. Looks like I'll be dropping by the Mystic Demon Library. While Ezra was talking to Fenrir, Eldarine had finished his explanations and began to leave. The atmosphere of Energy Mountain relaxed as chatter began to fill the place. Ravina swept a glance at Ezra Zephyr, with no intentions of talking to him as she turned around and began descending the mountain. She was clearly still a little miffed at the prince's rejection. Drake Tubble also headed down the mountain with numerous Shurian disciples crowding around him. His expression was indifferent, but when he walked past Ezra Zephyr, he paused and said, I am not too interested in you, but I am an acquaintance of Ravina's family, and hence hope that you will not become too friendly with her, while also giving her a little more respect. I do not intend to cause trouble for you, but I also hope that you do not come looking for it. Without waiting for Ezra Zephyr's reply, the former seemed to disdainfully brush past the latter. The Shurian first-class disciple entourage fearlessly swept their gazes at Ezra, as if slightly pitying the fact that he had drawn Drake's attention. Ezra paid no heed to their gazes, frowning slightly as he gazed at Drake's back. The superior air these Shurian disciples put up was really very unlikable. I too hope that you will not provoke me. He said in a loud voice, his eyes narrowed slightly, a certain sharpness appearing on his slightly pursed lips. Drake stopped and looked back at him. Or else, Shurian continent will lose a precious genius. He replied with a wicked grin. The eyes of Shurian's disciples widened and they moved towards Ezra. However, just at that time, hundreds of Naren continent geniuses gathered behind Ezra Zephyr. The tension rose, every eye was on these two groups who had been at each other's throats from the start. Let's go. Drake calmly said as the rest gritted their teeth and followed him. The prince giggled and looked at his subordinates. Who is hungry? Thousand Meal House. This was an eatery in the Outer Mountains area. For the numerous Outer Mountain disciples, it was a place with extremely good service. The wide range of delicacies available was only second to the high-grade ingredients used. Not only would the food satisfy your appetite, but it would also benefit your cultivation. Of course, one needed to pay spirit jade to enjoy the services here. Hence, extremely few disciples could afford to come here during the initial period. At this current moment, Ezra had brought XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Argue, Thur and the rest of the Naren geniuses here, and booked a table to celebrate his breakthrough to the second-level core formation stage. Whoa! I saw this place yesterday, but did not even dare to step in. Thanks to His Majesty, I can finally have a taste of its delicacies today. Gil Subzi chuckled, his face practically gleaming. After arriving at the spirit-devouring mountain, everyone had become rather poor, no longer the doted and pampered geniuses they were before. Hence, they were initially unable to afford to come to such a place. Ezra smiled, a smile filled with raw physical pain. When he ordered earlier, he had discovered that the main component of practically all of the dishes were first and second-tier martial animals. Even for the soup, numerous rare spiritual resources were used to enhance its flavor. His Majesty was so cool today. Let's see if they still dare to look down on our Naren continent. By the side, a rather pretty young girl with a goose-egg-shaped face grinned widely. She was called Amalia, and her house was also a noble house in a human kingdom. The others also smiled and nodded. One could see that they had completely put down their previous mental block and started to truly treat Ezra as their core. Over the past 2 days, they had clearly felt how intense the competition was in the spirit-devouring mountain. If they did not group together, they would only be bullied and trampled on by others. As the only 5 first-class disciples from the Naren continent, Ezra, Xyr, Zulfi, Argus, Shifa and Thur were the strongest among them. Thus, they naturally became the central pillars of the group, with Ezra as the supreme leader. Ezra looked at Thur and asked, "How does it feel like to have the 6th grade martial spirit?" "Haha, very powerful, Your Majesty." Thur answered with a grin. The cubic pill that he got on the spirity Peliok as the reward was given to Thur by him. Thur was the brains of his little army, however, he lacked in prowess compared to the other 3 of Bloodfang Kingdom. With the cubic pill that has a 6th grade martial spirit, that gap was filled. The prince turned at everyone and said, "Thur told me that the other disciples have begun forming their own groups and factions during the past 2 days, while we Naren disciples were the only ones that were left out. In hindsight, it was due to me that you guys were implicated." He gently smiled, before continuing, "I'm honestly interested in forming a group, but since we are all from the Naren continent, I will naturally try to take care of you guys." Gil Subzi lifted his cup and declared, "These words of His Majesty are enough already." As he spoke, he suddenly nudged the silent Sinzutun beside him. The latter's expression was somewhat rigid. He lifted his head and glanced at Ezra Zephyr, hesitating somewhat before he finally said, "Before we left the Naren continent, my father told me that he has sent an envoy to the Bloodfang Kingdom to seek an alliance." Ezra calmly nodded. It was not hard to believe that the wealthy merchandise owner of the human empire had done such a thing. One must know that Zutun merchandise was amongst the big traders of the human empire, and in terms of trade, no one could surpass the human race. This will open up a lot of doors for Bloodfang and will give its economy a huge boost. The reason why Sinzutun's father had done so was likely because he knew about the grudge between his son and Ezra Zephyr. Was this how the former planned to resolve it? What a tactic, he's a clever man. Ezra secretly thought to himself. The Zutun merchandise lord had chosen to ally with the Bloodfang Kingdom because of him. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom could not help but sigh inside. No wonder Zutun merchandise was growing increasingly powerful under the current lord's leadership. Ezra picked up his cup, and was silent for a moment, before he lifted it towards Sinzutun and said, "Let all our previous grudges end here." The main reason why Sinzutun had made things difficult for Ezra in the auction was due to Emily Joma's egging. However, the former had ended up gaining nothing, and instead made Ezra, a genius amongst geniuses, his enemy. After leaving the sovereignty side of Naren continent and arriving at the spirit-devouring mountain, Ezra's view of the world had changed, and the likes of Sinzutun no longer posed any threat in his eyes. Since the merchandise lord wants to resolve the grudge between the two of them, there was no reason for him to make a fuss, as he was a calculating man. Sinzutun's lips moved, but did not say anything in the end, merely lifting his own cup and downing it in a single go. Following the closure of their grudge, the atmosphere immediately eased up, turning noisy and lively. Everyone present was a youngster and had come a long way from home to this unfamiliar place. Hence, they soon warmed up to each other. Delicious dishes began to arrive one after another, and everyone could not help but begin to gorge themselves. Gil Gubsy was the most terrifying of the bunch, its mouth opening wide as it swallowed food several times larger than its body. Only Argus Waska gave him a competition. Zulfi and Thur were the most graceful, merely sampling some of the vegetables, with no interest in any of the food that was too strong in flavor. As more and more food entered their stomachs, everyone's faces began to flush as boiling heat rose within them. They could feel searing spiritual energy flowing within their bodies, ultimately swiftly flooding into their cores and pools. While everyone was happily digging in, laughter was heard. "Hee hee, Brother Ezra is so generous." Not many disciples will patronize Thousand Meal House at such a time. The prince raised his head and saw a young man standing to the side, a slight smile on his face as he watched them. It was the one who had spoken up for Ezra in Energy Mountain, Ash Beckham. Ezra had some good feelings towards the former and immediately rose as he answered with a smile. So it's fellow brother Ash Beckham. Disciples of the same status would call each other fellow brothers or fellow disciples. Ezra could tell that Ash had something to say, and thus pointed beside him and said, "Want to come over and have a seat?" Ash cheerfully consented, proceeding to sit down and chat with the rest for a while, before he finally looked towards Ezra and asked, "Fellow brother, are you interested in joining us along with everyone else?" He did not beat about the bush, directly stating his objective. XYR and the rest fell silent. There was not much surprise on Ezra's face, evidently having already guessed Ash's aim. Ash smiled and said, "Fellow brother should know that the competition in the Outer Mountains is extremely fierce, and the many disciples here have already formed various factions and groups. Grouping up and watching each other's backs is after all better than fighting alone. Moreover, the Shurian disciples' advantage is too great. They are too powerful and any non-Shurian disciple will be suppressed by them." Ash stared at Ezra as he slowly continued, "I've heard that there will only be 10 gold belt quotas in the upcoming peak selection ceremony, and the Shurian disciples have already declared that they will be taking them all, a truly overbearing declaration. Looks like fellow brother has yet to hear of this." Ash Beckham chuckled. "We are currently unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, and if we manage to enter the 7 peaks, we will become official Outer Mountain disciples. These official Outer Mountain disciples are also divided into different categories, from highest to the lowest, Diamond Belt disciples, Gold Belt disciples, and Silver Belt disciples. The higher one's rank, the higher one's status in the 7 peaks. In addition, one will also be granted completely different cultivation resources. The top 10 performers of every peak selection ceremony will directly become Gold Belt disciples, by passing the Silver Belt rank. Moreover, only the top 10 will be allowed to choose which peak to enter. The others will be allocated by the sect." At this point, Ezra and the rest began to frown. They had come to the spirit-devouring mountain to make their stronghold. If they ended up forcibly separated from many of the other peaks, won't they be unable to achieve their goal? Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. Looks like he and other strong members needed to each take one of the top 10 spots in the peak selection ceremony. As such, they would have to take them from the Shurian and Ryan disciples, and act akin to taking food from a tiger. Seated at the table, Ash Beckham smiled slightly as he looked at Ezra Zephyr's expression and said, "I can see that fellow brother Ezra is someone with ambition, and will not be satisfied with being the lowest-ranked Silver Belt disciple when entering the 7 peaks." Spirit-devouring mountain disciples were strictly regulated by a ranking system, which aimed to motivate the disciples and make them fight each other all the time. A higher-ranked disciple would not only enjoy high status, but also obtain more cultivation resources than the other disciples, cultivation resources that undoubtedly meant gaining a lead on others. Sometimes, it was as the saying went, once you're one step behind, you will always be that step behind. In fact, it may even result in you being forever being crushed under heel by others. Hence, there was no disciple who was willing to give up on their chance so easily during the peak selection ceremony. The group I'm in has 5 first-class disciples, including myself. If we were to talk about strength, our group was one of the stronger ones amongst the non-Shurian disciple factions. Before your Naren continent showed up, now the strongest faction is yours." Ash Beckham fervently looked at Ezra as he continued, "If fellow brother joins us, we will be able to attract even more disciples to our group. When that happens, we will not lose out even to the Shurian and Ryan factions." He then looked towards Gil Subzi, Sinzutun and the rest as he said, "When that time comes, the other Naren disciples can also join us." Ezra Zephyr squinted his eyes. "You mean only first-class disciples can join your faction?" "Yes, we cannot divide our attention with second- and third-class disciples at the moment." However, Gil Subzi, Sinzutun and the rest did not speak. They merely looked towards Ezra Zephyr, clearly waiting for his decision. The prince held the cup in silence for a while, before he slowly shook his head under Ash Beckham's fervent gaze. I don't think I'll be able to join fellow brother Ash's group. In the Thousand Meal House. Ezra still ended up rejecting Ash's invitation, because he knew that though there was power in numbers, it also came with more disputes and troubles, and he has to take care of his own force. Ezra's three main objectives in the spirit-devouring mountain were to reach the Foundation establishment stage as soon as possible. Second was to rule this entire sect with his little army, and the third was to find anything related to fight between the sect's patriarch and Bjorn's first disciple. He also has the thought of his kingdom in mind. Though the Brownmane Empire was currently doing all it could to stabilize the situation at its borders, once Emperor Bruce Brownmane got his hands free, he would surely turn his eyes to the Bloodfang Kingdom. Therefore, Ezra needed to step into the Foundation establishment stage before that happened. And there was an inevitable war with Duo Mountain Peak. He did not wish to waste any potential training time on disputes and meaningless politics in groups such as these. He will simply make himself and his little faction more powerful, only then, he will step into the political power struggle. Disappointment rose on Ash's face in response to Ezra's rejection. The former was not angry, however, only feeling that it was such a pity. Although I cannot join your group, I am willing to become friends with fellow brother. If we have any needs in the future, we can always help each other. Ezra gave a faint smile, his scarlet eyes glowed. He did not want to tangle himself in the group and leave his people aside, but he was willing to be friends with Ash. The latter's character was pretty good, and quite to Ezra's liking. Ash also smiled when he heard this, and candidly said, "That's exactly what I'm looking for." He did not try to persuade or force the prince, because he was confident in his judgment. Ezra might seem as if he had just reached the second-level core formation, but Ash had the feeling that the latter was not as simple as he appeared on the surface. Although fellow brother Ezra is not joining us, the others can still join us if they are interested. Ash indicated towards XYR, Argus, Zulfi, Shifa, and Thur with a grin. After all, these five were also first-class disciples. Argus shook his head, and Shifa glared at Ash in anger. Zulfi replied, "We will follow His Majesty, his cause is ours. I must decline your offer. You shouldn't recruit any Naren geniuses, fellow brother Ash, it's fruitless," said Thur. XYR, who spoke late, looked at Ash in his eyes. "You are not worthy to be my master. I am sure that if we fight a life-and-death battle, I can win." Ash Beckham was stunned when he heard that. He remembered this guy who destroyed a third-level core formation expert while being on first level. He was someone that even Shurian factions desired to have. A rare prodigy with great aptness, an anomaly with two martial spirits. Why does someone like him is following fellow brother Ezra? Ash thought. Seeing the expression of Ash, Ezra lifted his cup and said, "I am thankful to fellow brother Ash Beckham for our friendship." Ash chuckled, knowing that Ezra was trying to divert the situation. Since both of them were now much closer, Ash could not help but ask, "Right, fellow brother, I'm dying to know, since you brought back so much heavenly turbulence on your first try, how many spiritual energy gobs did you create?" XYR and the rest also opened their ears, evidently equally curious. Ezra laughed and lifted his cup, downing in a single gulp, before he answered, "Only about 100. Huh. A series of gasps sounded around the tablet, Zulfi and the rest dumbstruck. They were also core formation practitioners, but the number of spiritual energy gobs in their core only numbered slightly over 30. Ash also opened and closed his mouth. In the end, he let out a bitter chuckle. Let alone the rest, even a third-level core formation expert wouldn't have 100 gobs. In other words, if they were to compete purely based on the amount of spiritual energy, a third-level core formation expert like himself may not be able to beat Ezra. This caused him to sigh deeply. He was truly unable to comprehend how Ezra's spiritual energy had reached such a level. However, this also made Ash Beckham rejoice. It seems that his judgment was right after all. The young man before him was indeed extraordinary. Though the latter currently did not have much of a reputation, Ash had a premonition that there would be no one in the future spirit-devouring mountain who would not know Ezra Zephyr. He took his farewell and was about to leave when he stopped. A ponder haunted his mind as he pivoted back and looked at the sorcerer with the straw hat. "Brother XYR, what about you? How many gobs did you make when you called?" "Heavenly Tribulation?" XYR replied indifferently. 79. Ash laughed bitterly and went on his way. After the Energy Mountain training, Ezra Zephyr headed straight for the Mystic Demon Library. He had been itching to visit this place ever since yesterday. The Mystic Demon Library was a majestic ancient-looking building that stood at the peak of one of the towering mountains. From the seemingly unending stream of disciples moving towards it, one could see that this place was undoubtedly one of the most popular locations in the outer mountains. The Mystic Demon Library was extremely enormous, and was divided into 3 levels. Beta layer and 3rd, 4th circles techniques were stored on the 1st level, Gamma layer and 5th, 6th circles on the 2nd, and it was said that the 3rd held Delta layer and 7th, 8th circles techniques. However, the rental fee was extremely high, and current disciples could not possibly afford them. Hence, Ezra made a beeline to the 2nd level. A Gamma layer technique was more than attractive enough to his current self. There were very few disciples on the 2nd level, because although the Gamma layer techniques here were powerful, they were even more difficult to learn. Everyone currently did not have many spirit jade pieces at hand, and thus did not want to waste them, planning instead to visit later on when they had accumulated enough. The 2nd level looked even better than the 1st, with numerous jade strips hovering above white jade displays. Light shined from these jade strips, forming numerous words in the air in front of him. "There's so many." Ezra was amazed by this sight. He estimated that there were over 1,000 of them after a cursory glance. This number truly shocked him to the core. One must know that a Gamma layer technique would be cherished as one of the most prized possessions by the sovereign factions in the Naren continent. And yet, they were now so common here. From this, one could see just how terrifying the spirit-devouring mountain's foundations were. Even he doesn't have 10th of this much Gamma layer skills. Fenrir only had treasures, pills, and ingredients. However, he does have millions of skills in his memory, but not in the physical form like the ones in this library. Ezra Zephyr wet his lips, his gaze burning as he walked forward step by step, passing white jade platform after platform. Low-tier little Gamma layer skill, mountain shaking finger. 5th circle spell, fire god sword. Mid-tier Gamma layer skill, bones of demons. The prince's gaze swept across the words in front of numerous jade strips, discovering that the spiritual techniques here had been meticulously categorized. According to his estimates, the glittering wind and light skill he obtained in the spirity Peliok would be classified as a low-tier Gamma layer skill. "What I need the most now is a movement-type spiritual technique," mumbled Ezra to himself. He was really awed by the movement spiritual techniques of Carlo and Rollo but to his disappointment, he couldn't find the scroll in them. Hence, Ezra had been planning on finding a same-level movement technique. The techniques they used were Alpha level and 2nd circle. But, that rank of theirs was placed in the upper realm. In this lower realm, those 2 similar spiritual techniques could be categorized at least as high-tier Gamma layer skill and 6th circle spell. His feet continued their slow advance. After about 10 minutes, they finally came to a stop in front of a certain white jade display as Ezra Zephyr's burning gaze stared at the ancient jade strip before him. A mid-tier Gamma layer skill, Gossamer steps. Make the movement akin to an illusion, making it difficult to discern what is real, and impossible to catch like the wind. Ezra Zephyr's heart shook. Gossamer steps was clearly out of the ordinary. It needed a wind attribute's proficiency. Without any hesitation, he reached out to grab the jade strip. However, just as his fingers touched it, another fair hand suddenly appeared from the side, grabbing the other corner of the jade strip. Ezra Zephyr turned his scarlet eyes to the owner of that hand, only to see a pair of bright eyes glaring back at him. A closer look revealed that it was a young lady with a sexy body and eye-grabbing legs in red. Who could it be but Ravina Ingale? Ezra Zephyr was a little surprised for a time as he gazed at the girl in red who had also chosen the Gossamer steps technique. She was usually the focus of attention amongst the outer mountain disciples, and was not only blessed with good looks, but also superb talent. Most importantly, of course, it was said that she had some ties in the spirit-devouring mountain, practically making her one of the most welcomed individuals in the eyes of the male Outer Mountain disciples. "You're also choosing it?" Ezra asked in a cold voice. However, a thought came to his mind and he let go of that spiritual technique. Although most of the Ryan disciples gave off an air of superiority and were extremely arrogant, not much of it could be seen from Ravina in Gale, despite the fact that she was from Ryan continent. It was as if there was no difference between the disciples in her eyes, which was also why Ezra Zephyr voluntarily released his grip. Just because someone else had chosen a spiritual technique here did not mean that others no longer had any chance. Hence, Ezra Zephyr did not mind giving way to a lady, or maybe he had different plans in his mind. "Oh, how courteous." Ravina glanced at him but did not accept the prince's goodwill. She released her fingers and said, "Forget it, I am not someone with a wind attribute." After speaking, she confidently turned around and left, leaving behind a slight fragrance as her fine black hair brushed past in front of Ezra Zephyr. However, she suddenly stopped after 2 steps, slightly tilting her head back as her bright eyes looked towards Ezra Zephyr. "But I advise you not to choose this spiritual technique." "Why?" Ezra asked indifferently. The girl in red replied, "Because Moshe's brother is the one giving instructions on this spiritual technique." Ezra's frown deepened, his tone calm as he asked, "What does that have to do with me? Am I not allowed to learn any spiritual techniques he teaches?" The corners of Ravina's red lips rose slightly. No comment. One could tell that she was still harboring a tiny grudge from when Ezra had rejected her in front of everyone yesterday. Hence, she returned him the exact same words he had given her. Ezra Zephyr watched her slender, graceful figure leave. As she strode forward with her long legs, every male disciple on the second level seemingly followed her. "Women are indeed good at holding grudges," mumbled Ezra to himself as he continued. "But, I understand what she warned about." He grinned. His gaze quickly turned towards the jade stripe before him, a satisfied smile forming on his lips as he reached out to take it. With the jade strip now in hand, some simple information flowed into his head: the cost of renting the jade strip. 5 spirit jade pieces a day. Recorded within these jade strips were the detailed cultivation method and the experiences of numerous elders and seniors. Even so, it was exceedingly difficult to learn, requiring ordinary disciple would have to spend a tremendous amount of time. This would undoubtedly be a huge expenditure of spirit jades. In the Mystic Demon Library, Ezra looked at the costly spiritual techniques. The majority of the disciples would seek out instructors in the Mystic Demon Library after choosing a spiritual technique. These instructors would point them in the right direction, allowing them to more easily master the technique. So expensive. Ezra could not help but sigh. Though the 40 or so spiritual jade pieces might seem like a lot, they were really not enough. And he could not exchange them with any treasure, that would be against the rules and might cause him problems if the news gets out. Ezra continued advancing with the jade strip, but stopped again after a few steps, his eyeballs nearly popping from their sockets as he stared at a jade strip that was now before him. 8 Lost Dragons, High-Tier Gamma Layer Skill. Can create 8 dragons made of pure spiritual energy, peerless and tyrannical. These short few words gave off a tyrannical aura, displaying the power of the spiritual technique. Ezra's heart trembled with desire, but his expression turned stiff when he saw the rental price. The 8 lost dragons required 20 spirit jade pieces a day, 4 times of the Gas-Emmer Step spiritual technique. The prince could not help but curse through gritted teeth, ultimately making the painful decision to give up on it for the time being. He planned to first master Gossamer Steps, gather enough spirit jade and then return to rent the 8 lost dragons. Ezra Zephyr forcibly pulled his gaze away from the jade strip, tightening his grip around the Gossamer Steps jade strip as he turned around and quickly walked off. He soon arrived at the counter and handed the jade strip to a middle-aged man behind it. The man picked up a jade booklet to record as he asked, "Pass me your disciple token." Also, the Gossamer Step spiritual technique costs 5 spirit jade pieces a day, How many days do you plan on leasing it? The prince pondered for a moment and answered, I'll go with 5 days. He'll first see to what extent he can master the Gossamer Steps technique in 5 days. The middle-aged manager nodded and said, Are you intending to find a spiritual technique instructor that has learned it already? The werewolf prince was silent for a brief moment before asking, Do you have any recommendations? Gamma layer skills were rather difficult to comprehend, and it was easy to take the wrong path if one were to blindly grasp about on his own, causing even more time to be wasted. At times, having someone else's guidance would be a huge help. He had the experience, as the Razor Pearl Eagle helped him with glittering wind and light after he made it his undead soldier. The middle-aged manager thought for a bit, retrieved a jade tile and handed it to Ezra. Most of the instructors here are real Outer Mountain disciples from the 7 Peaks, and there's currently only one of them who has learnt the Gossamer Steps technique. The price of listening to his teachings is also 5 spirit jade pieces per day. Ezra curiously received the jade tile and found a name inscribed on it. Roshi. Without raising his head, the middle-aged manager continued, The practice halls are in the mountain behind the Mystic Demon Library. You can go find them yourself. Remember to return the jade strip when the deadline comes, or it will be forcibly taken back together with a fine. Ezra bowed to show respect. He picked up the Gossamer Steps jade strip and left the Mystic Demon Library, heading towards the rear mountain. In the rear mountain, he saw several unique buildings where disciples were constantly entering and leaving, an exceptionally bustling sight. The prince followed the directions, eventually arriving before a wide and spacious building. After confirming the instructor's name at the front door, he walked in. Behind the doors was an extremely spacious hall where a dozen or so figures were seated in a circle. At their center was a tall man who was currently eloquently giving a lecture. Ezra's entrance interrupted the lecture, causing the dozen listening figure to turn their heads and look. Ezra smiled slightly, because he had just seen a familiar figure amongst them. It was the one who got his first disciple quota snatched by XYR, after a quarrel with Ezra due to Peliok on Energy Mountain, Moshi. The instructor seated in the center looked towards Ezra and nonchalantly asked, Who are you? He had a thin face and a stern expression in his eyes, while powerful spiritual energy rippled around him. Unofficial Outer Mountain disciple, Ezra Zephyr. His expression remained calm as he cupped his fists together towards the man. His gaze swept towards Moshi before turning back to the inner mountain disciple called Roshi. The two rather resembled each other, making him begin to realize why Ravina had warned him earlier. Ezra Zephyr? Roshi was taken aback, casting a glance at Moshi as the latter nodded with an icy smile. The former had heard an exaggerated description of how arrogant this kid and his companions from this remote continent were from Moshi earlier, but he never imagined that Ezra, their leader, would actually come here and seek guidance from him. The prince's expression was still unchanged as he said in neither an overbearing nor servile tone, I've chosen the Gossamer Steps technique, and have come here hoping to listen to the key points with regards to it. Here are 5 spirit jade pieces. The official Outer Mountain disciple Roshi swept a nonchalant gaze at Ezra as contempt faintly rose from the corners of his lips. No need. The class is already full and we won't be accepting anyone new for the time being. Moshi was his younger brother, and since he had a dispute with Ezra, Roshi naturally found Ezra a sore sight. Roshi's words caused laughter to sound in the hall. Most of the disciples here were from the Shurian continent and thus looked towards Ezra with mocking eyes. The prince frowned slightly, however, he was not expecting Roshi to take things so far. So, this spirit-devouring mountain is a wild place. Haha, I like it, he said to himself. After which, he slowly said, Isn't senior brother Roshi's actions a little against the rules? A full class was clearly an excuse. Oh? A mere unofficial Outer Mountain disciple thinks he has the right to talk to me about the rules? Roshi's eyes narrowed slightly, a sneer appearing from the corners of his mouth. In the next moment, powerful spiritual energy abruptly exploded from his body, forming an overwhelming pressure that loomed towards Ezra Zephyr. At the rear mountain, Roshi's strength had at the very least reached the 5th level core formation stage, far surpassing everyone present. Hence, when the spiritual energy pressure surged towards Ezra Zephyr, his breathing turned a little ragged. Crackle crackle. However, just as Roshi was about to force the prince into a miserable state, the clothes at his area moved as black lightning bolted its way out with a deafening thundering noise. The black bolts leapt out, dancing around the body of Ezra Zephyr as the sliver of reddish lightning gleamed. In a short span of seconds, Ezra unleashed his spiritual energy. Savagery violently pulsed from it as berserk chaos force began to wreak havoc. Crackle, crackle. The entire hall shook as Roshi's spiritual energy pressure was instantly ripped to shreds, causing him to be forced back several steps by Chaos Lightning's ferocity as his face paled slightly. Roshi's complexion was steely green with fear and anger as he sternly shouted, "You dare to use your spiritual energy to hurt me?" The prince swept the former a cold look as he spread his signature grin on his face. After sweeping a glance at Roshi, the chaotic bolts of lightning began to shrink. The hall was now a mess, Moshi and the other disciples scurrying to the side as they looked towards Ezra in uncertainty. Behind Ezra came a lady in a red dress. Her red lips parted slightly as she said, "Senior brother Roshi, your rejection is not in line with the rules. It will not be good for you either if the law enforcement group finds out." Roshi looked at the girl. She was none other than Ravina in Gale. A smile was revealed on his face. "Since junior sister Ravina has spoken, I will naturally give face." Ravina's elder was one of the high-ranking members of the spirit-devouring mountain, and Roshi naturally did not dare to offend her. However, the prince merely glanced at the former coldly and said, "Can't even beat an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple, what can I learn by staying here? It will only be a waste of spirit jade." Contempt rose from the corners of his mouth, ignoring Roshi's white with rage complexion as he turned around and left. Roshi's eyes darkened as he watched the man from Naren continent leave. Soon after, he let out a chilling chuckle. "What an ignorant fool, go ahead with your arrogance. Do you really think you'll be able to learn the Gossamer Steps technique without my guidance? When you've squandered away all of your spirit jade, you'll still end up coming back to beg me." After leaving the rear mountain, Ezra's expression was still somewhat gloomy. He had not expected such a coincidence to occur. To think that the instructor he encountered would be Moshi's elder brother. Looks like Ravina had meant well when she tried to warn him earlier. She was just a little too proud and had not fully explained everything. "I refuse to believe that I will be unable to learn the technique without an instructor." Ezra grasped the jade strip as his eyes hardened. It was indeed not a simple task to learn a gamma layer skill, but he did not believe he would really be unable to learn it without any guidance. In the worst-case scenario, he would just have to waste a little more time. Even though he said so, Roshi had really ruined his mood today. Ezra was in a slightly foul mood as he left the rear mountain and went to his little house. It was then that he heard the voice of his partner. "Boy. Shut up, Fenrir, I am already pissed." Ezra retorted. "Ho ho, why didn't you kill him then?" Fenrir mocked. "I am not an idiot, now let me think of a way to learn this spiritual technique." Fenrir laughed and said a mere Outer Mountain disciple will at best have an elementary mastery of the Gossamer Steps skill. How can he possibly have the qualifications to master it completely? If you had chosen to stay, it would only have been a waste of spirit jades. Those spirit jades would be better off used to other important ingredients. After a small pause, Fenrir spoke again. "Let's see the spiritual technique that you have chosen." Fenrir said in a low-pitched voice. He looked interested. The werewolf prince retrieved the jade strip and opened it. Fenrir looked at it through Ezra's gaze and slightly shut his eyes. A long while later, he slowly opened them and said, "This spiritual technique is a little useful. Your judgment is not bad. Learning it is not difficult, it merely requires first knitting 106 yarns in the body, before pouring in wind essence to temper them. At the advanced stage, one will be able to turn one's movement gossamer like the wind and travel 1,000 miles in an instant. However, the slightly more troublesome part is that there are millions and millions of yarns in the body, and their locations are different for everyone. Only by gradually trying to feel them would one be able to unblock the 106 yarns. I believe the so-called instructor will only be giving them some suggestions when the disciples are doing the sensing wrongly, and get them to restart the process, making him pretty much useless. A brief observation was all Fenrir needed to understand the intricacies of the Gossamer Step spiritual technique. Such terrifying comprehensive ability stupefied Ezra Zephyr a little, but then he remembered the caliber of Fenrir. Ezra's white teeth gleamed as he asked with a smile, "Does that mean you will teach me how to knit the 106 yarns? Yarns are like threads, just like spiritual energy is directly connected with the chi core of a cultivator or mana pool of a sorcerer. However, a spiritual technique is not only linked with the core but also with the brain. The brain uses its ability to create a technique out of stored spiritual energy in the core. The thing connecting both core and brain are invisible threads called yarns. In spells, those yarns create circles. However, in skills, those yarns knit together to perform the skill. Every spiritual technique needs a specific number of yarns to be learnt. The number of yarns needed for Gossamer Steps is 106. Fenrir shook her head. "I can, but I won't." However, the monstrous wolf then extended his palm and pointed at Ezra Zephyr. "But you can." The prince was utterly confused, evidently unable to understand what he meant by that. Fenrir could not help but laugh at the sight of his lost appearance. "You truly like someone who does not realize he lives on a treasure mountain. After 5 years of that cruel technique in the cave, you didn't only improve your physical power but also your mental capacity is increased a lot. Those pills and different fruits were not just belly filler, but actual treasures. You are beyond the likes of even Carlo or... Not to mention, you just unsealed your first seal on the bloodline of the Draculwolf family. You have the ability to see the vulnerabilities or weak points in any spiritual techniques if you pay attention. Not only the enemy's, but also your own. Remember the time you made Chaos Chains another spell?" Ezra Zephyr's eyes grew brighter and brighter as Fenrir spoke. He now understood the meaning behind his partner's earlier words, and slowly said, "I have belittled myself. I apologize for letting you down, Fenrir." Fenrir gave a slight nod. "As such, there is no need for you to painstakingly feel out the yarn's locations. You only need to use your concentration to find them. This will be multiple times more effective than others. So why would you need an elementary-level Outer Mountain disciple's guidance?" Ezra could not help but powerfully hammer his fists together. Even someone usually as calm as himself could not help but be overwhelmed by joy as he winked at the black wolf. "Haha, Fenrir, you're too awesome. I'll go try it out first and see if I can find the yarns in my body." After speaking, he slipped away to the rear courtyard to try out the Gossamer Step spiritual technique. A slight smile appeared on Ezra's face as he left. Soon after, he remembered something. He stopped and looked towards a direction as his scarlet eyes squinted in a slightly chilling manner. "Come out." A pentagon was formed and a martial animal came out. Kiriririr. A chilling screech leapt by it. It was Razor Pearl Eagle, the undead soldier of Ezra Zephyr who recently became a lower third-tier martial animal. He gently patted the eagle and it raised its head. "I haven't given you a name yet. From now on, you are Twinkle," said Ezra. Kriririr. Twinkle gave a satisfied cry and nodded her head. "Go teach that fellow a lesson," said an expressionless Ezra. What right did a mere Outer Mountain disciple have to disrespect him? Kriiriri. Twinkle released a low cry upon hearing this, an excited look flooding out its red shining eyes. Its figure moved its wings flaps, transforming into a flash of sparkling light as it shot forth into the sky. Ezra watched Razor Pearl Eagle disappear before he moved on his way again. Night descended. Roshi walked out of his teaching hall to watch the disciples disperse. Their respectful farewells to him when they left made him feel increasingly pleased with himself inside. Behind Roshi, Moshi laughed and said, "Hee hee, I have to thank Elder Brother for giving Ezra Zephyr such a miserable time today. It was so refreshing." Roshi smiled faintly. "He's merely an ignorant country bumpkin from this tiny continent. Does he really believe that a gamma layer skill will be so easy to learn? When he comes begging, watch how I'll humiliate him. I've also told the other Outer Mountain fellow brother disciples to make sure he won't find even a single instructor. I'll make it such that he'll be unable to learn even a single spiritual technique. Moshi also laughed icily and nodded. Roshi said, head on back first, and work hard to master the Gossamer Step spiritual technique during the next few days such that you will have something to show for yourself in the peak selection ceremony. Moshi acknowledged, turned around and left. After sending him off, Roshi began to return to his dwelling. Outer Mountain disciples naturally received far better treatment than the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, each one owning a good place to practice. Rohi rose on his spiritual energy, jumping past a mountain when his expression suddenly changed, because a flash of sparkling light was rapidly approaching him from below like a bolt of lightning. Who? Roared Roshi as the spiritual energy in his body began to surge out. With a swing of his hand, spiritual energy transformed into a giant hand that was dozens of feet wide, mercilessly swatting down at the sparkling light. Boom. However, the sparkling light showed no indications of stopping. A low peal seemed to be heard as a sharp shiny whip suffused with colorful gleam abruptly slashed downwards. In that instant, even space itself seemed to disintegrate. The giant spiritual energy hand was ruptured in a mere few breaths as sharp whippy winds continued on their path. A foul smell assaulted Roshi's face, quickly followed by intense pain. Arg! He could not help but scream. A pearl-like claw appeared in front of his face, slashing all the way to his waist as his clothes were torn to shreds, making him an extremely miserable sight to see. Fresh blood dripped down his eyes, causing Roshi to explode with anger. Spiritual energy madly burst out, but before he could counter-attack, the sparkling light sent another attack, a whip like a feather. Swwissh. The leg of Roshi was cut off and fell, the sparkling light had already disappeared into the boundless night sky. Roshi blankly stared at his surroundings in the air as his body trembled uncontrollably. He was no fool. He quickly assumed that the black light was definitely related to Ezra Zephyr. But so what if he knew? Could he say that he was brought to such a state by an unofficial Outer Mountain disciple? What face would he have if this spread back to the Seven Peaks? Thus, Roshi burst into a rage. Ezra! I will make sure you're unable to learn even a single spiritual energy technique. In the night, Roshi's furious and bitter howl rang out like a wild beast's. A creek flowed in the mountain, making clear sounds as the water beat against the rock. Ezra's figure was seated on a rock by the creek with his eyes faintly shut. At this moment, his breathing seemed to become extremely weak. The spiritual energy in his body slowly began to flow in his channels according to the instructions in the Gossamer Steps technique. The crux of this technique was to knit 106 yarns, and at this point in time, the prince was going to find the location of the first yarn. This was something he had to do by himself, because even though he possessed a high aptitude that could view the weak points of any technique, he needed to first give it somewhere to start. Without the first yarn as a primer of sorts, how could the second yarn be found? The spiritual energy in his body circulated in his channels, time and time again, an exceedingly boring process. However, Ezra's heart was akin to a still lake as he concentrated on sensing any strange disturbances in the spiritual energy flow. Half a day passed in this manner. Only now did the prince understand how troublesome it was to practice the Gossamer Steps method. He had already used slightly over half a day for the first yarn alone. It was difficult to imagine how long it would take if he were to find and knit even more yarns by himself. Fortunately, on the 100th round along the route indicated by the Gossamer Steps technique, the prince finally sensed a tiny disturbance. The instant this tiny disturbance appeared, the long-waiting Ezra immediately turned his chaos force, directing its full power towards the origin of the disturbance. A faint prickling pain was felt as Ezra felt a yarn in his body. The moment this happened, the spiritual energy flowing through the route given by the Gossamer Steps technique began to flow little by little. A certain subtle sensation rose that allowed the prince to understand that he had found the first yarn and knit it. Next, I'll have to smoothen the yarns with energy, before infusing it with wind essence. Ezra Zephyr breathed an almost inaudible sigh of relief, before he once again began to circulate his energy, wisp after wisp flowing into the yarn that began to smoothen it according to a unique method. Inside the yarn, sliver after sliver of spiritual energy gathered as threads, seemingly transforming into a strong rope that soon started to tighten at a unique frequency as it smoothed the yarn as a whole. This smoothing method was the essence of the Gossamer Steps technique. Only by using this procedure would the wind essence be able to fuse with the yarn later on. The prince very carefully manipulated his energy as he continued to smoothen the yarn. In the beginning, his control was rather rough and unpracticed, but gradually grew more and more polished as time passed, allowing the smoothing process to become much quicker. Hence, after about 4 hours, the yarn felt smooth and long, the process was done. With a slight grin on his face, Ezra gave a light jerk on his wolf bracelet, causing a transparent jade bottle to appear in his hand. Inside the bottle, a tornado swirled. The gale within this bottle was the so-called wind essence. Wind essence was formed from the agglomeration of spiritual energy and the wind attribute. It was a rather bizarre, but seemingly magical process. Of course, Ezra had not collected it himself, but had bought it with Spirit Jade in the Evil Treasure Pavilion, a tyrannic name for a treasure shop. A single bottom of wind essence had cost him 2 pieces of Spirit Jade. It should be enough for 3 days, mumbled Ezra to himself. With a thought, waves of wind began rising from the bottle, transforming into smoke that flowed in through Ezra's nose. Once the wind essence was in his body, Ezra began directing it through his channels. There was not much spiritual energy contained within the wind essence, making it very easily absorbed or dispersed by the black lightning in his body. Hence, Ezra needed to guard it with his full attention as he sent sliver after sliver into the yarn he had smoothed earlier. Wind essence flowed into the yarn, drifting about as it stealthily fused into it. As wind essence continued to be infused, he began to feel a very faint sensation spreading from the yarn as it started to knit, seemingly forced by the wind. This went on for another 2 hours. The prince suddenly opened his eyes, faint wind seemingly swirling within them, before scattering completely a moment later. Joy appeared on his face. He had finally completed the first of the 106 yarns of the Gossamer Steps technique. He lifted his head to look at the sky, discovering that the first yarn had taken him nearly an entire day. At this rate, it would take nearly a month to complete the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique. There were 3 levels to the Gossamer Steps technique. Only by knitting 2 sets of 35 yarns would one reach the next level. Thank goodness. Fenrir spoke. Thank me, boy. Ezra grinned slightly. Now that the first yarn was done, he could find the location of the second one. As such, he would be able to cut out the most troublesome sensing process. At this point, Ezra sent out a thought without any hesitation. He concentrated. The spiritual energy in his body began to follow the path indicated in the Gossamer Steps technique again, while his pupils seemed to pierce through his body, focusing on the location of the first yarn. The strange yet wonderful ripple seemed to pulse. On a mountain, the prince was focused. The ripple spread, and a few minutes later, Ezra's heart violently shook when he saw a strange ripple suddenly pulse from a certain location in his body. There was no hesitation whatsoever as energy charged towards it. The familiar prickling pain was felt as another yarn was knitted. The instant it knitted, Ezra sensed a thin thread of spiritual energy extended from the first yarn, linking up with the new yarn and establishing a connection. This phenomenon clearly showed that this was the correct location of the second yarn. His eyes opened as they rapidly filled with elation. Sensing the first yarn had taken a good half of the day, but with the unheard talent of his, he had drastically shortened the time required. Moreover, the subsequent yarns would only become harder and harder to sense, but this was clearly not going to be a problem for him. Only now did he fully realize how miraculous his power was. With it, he would be able to more efficiently master any spiritual technique he desired, making him far more efficiently than others. A fire began to burn in Ezra's eyes as he softly chuckled. Roshi, I'll show you that even without your guidance, I will still be able to master the gossamer steps technique. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes again, and began to polish the second yarn. He could find the aperture locations, but he would still have complete the subsequent processes himself. Hence, besides being present for the Energy Mountain training, all of Ezra's time during the next 3 days was invested in the gossamer steps technique. As he tirelessly continued to work, a total of 18 of the 106 yarns were knitted by him in 3 short days. The first level of the gossamer steps technique was fast approaching. However, while the prince was immersed in his training, waves were churning in the outer mountains, causing many disciples to be shocked. The origin of these waves was, to everyone's surprise, the instructors from the rear mountain of the Mystic Demon Library. These instructors had high status in the outer mountains due to 2 main reasons. Firstly, they were official outer mountain disciples. Secondly, they guided the other disciples in learning spiritual techniques. However, several instructors secretly spread that Ezra Zephyr would be restricted from attending the lectures for the spiritual techniques they were in charge of. This news caused quite an uproar, with numerous disciples feeling pity towards Ezra Zephyr. No one had expected him to have stirred up these instructors this time. Concerning such matters, the outer mountain manager Eldarine should have stepped up to put a stop to it. However, he seemed to be ignoring it, causing it to become an extremely hot topic in the outer mountains. I heard that Ezra Zephyr angered Roshi. Roshi is after all an official outer mountain disciple and has many friends. The other instructors would naturally not risk offending, hence why they've declared that they won't be teaching Ezra any spiritual techniques. Ezra is really too arrogant. To think that he even dares to offend senior brother Roshi. I've heard that they declined other Naren continent's disciples as well. This will be a huge blow to the Naren's geniuses. Yeah, without the guidance of the instructors, what can Ezra and his people possibly learn by themselves? If this continues, he won't be able to perform well in the peak selection ceremony 3 months later. He deserves it. Let's see what he can do now that he's being shut out by all the instructors. Similar whispers spread to every corner of the outer mountains, an indication that the number of gloating people was not few. After all, there were many people who were envious of Ezra and others' first-class disciple status. In a certain hall, Roshi stood with his hands behind his back, while Moshi and the rest of the disciples were seated on mats in front of him, their eyes closed as they tried to sense for yarns. All of a sudden, Moshi opened his eyes, happiness flashing across his face as he exclaimed, "I've knitted my 6th yarn." The others also opened their eyes, their envious gazes looking towards him. The scars on Roshi's face had yet to fully heal. He smiled and nodded. "There's no need for the rest of you to be envious. Moshi's talent is better than yours, so his progress is not surprising." The other disciples respectfully said with a smile, "Well, it's still thanks to senior brother Roshi's guidance." Moshi cupped his fists together towards Roshi, showing his gratitude. Roshi seemed to nonchalantly wave his hand, but the pleased look that faintly rose from the corners of his mouth was a little difficult to hide. With his hands behind his back, he raised his gaze and peered into the distance as an icy smile suddenly appeared on his face. He wondered how many yarns Ezra Zephyr had managed to knit. It was likely that he had yet to even reach that point, right? Ezra, oh Ezra Zephyr, you must be regretting it now that there's no one to teach you, right? But even if you go down on your knees and beg me now, I will never teach you. Since you've offended me, I'll let you know the meaning of eternal despair. By the side of a creek, Ezra still spent the majority of his time here training, while naturally blocking off the various matters and happenings of the outside world. All of his attention was placed on mastering the gossamer steps technique. It was the 5th day since he borrowed the jade strip. Although these 5 days were short, they were unbelievably enriching to the prince. In these short 5 days, he had knitted 30 of the 106 yarns. Only 6 remained till he reached the 1st level. When that happened, the true wonders of the gossamer steps technique would begin to be revealed. Atop the rock, Ezra Zephyr opened his eyes, wind gathering within them before gradually disappearing as a satisfied smile appeared from the corners of his lips. He had just completed another yarn, his total count now reaching 31. 31 yarns in 5 days. If not for the talent of his, Ezra would not have even dared to imagine such progress. The wind essence has been used up, I'll have to go buy more. It's also time to return the jade strip, but it's a little unfortunate about the numerous experiences from the seniors and elders recorded inside. Looks like I'll need to borrow it again when needed. Ezra began to calculate, and a pained look suddenly rose on his face. He had realized he now had less than 10 spirit jade pieces remaining. All of his time had been spent on the Gossamer Steps technique, and he had not visited the task pavilion nor taken on any assignments there. Hence, he naturally had no spirit jade earnings. While he sighed, several figures flew over from far away, landing beside the creek. Ezra Zephyr lifted his head, discovering that it was XYR, their Gale Arms, Zulfi Dimitri, and the rest. Your Majesty, you're living a little too relaxed. Their's tensed face was filled with worry. Your Majesty, we are in really big trouble this time. Argus let out a bitter laugh. We ended up offending the instructor, they're after all official Outer Mountain disciples, while we're merely tiny shrimps in comparison. Moreover, we have to rely on their guidance to learn our spiritual techniques. Shut up, Argus. Are you questioning His Majesty? Zulfi warned, he acted as second in charge after Ezra Zephyr. During the past 2 days, news that Ezra Zephyr and Naren Continent's disciples had been shut out from all the instructor lessons had spread like wildfire. As a result, all the geniuses of Naren were no longer able to sit still and came rushing over. The prince did hear about it a little, but did not pay much attention to it. From his point of view, he currently did not need the guidance of those so-called Outer Mountain disciples. Your Majesty, maybe you should yield to Roshi. I'll go back and help you send him some gifts to see if we can resolve this matter, said Gil Subzi. He thought very highly of Ezra Zephyr and did not want him to end up being unable to learn any spiritual techniques due to a single impulsive clash that had led to Roshi sabotaging the former. Everyone was desperately trying to raise their strength during these 3 months, and learning spiritual techniques was one of utmost importance. If Ezra and they were to be disadvantaged in this aspect, they would surely fall behind others in the peak selection ceremony 3 months later. The prince merely chuckled when he heard this, his impression of Gil Subzi growing a little more favorable. He waved his hand and said, You need not worry, I know what I'm doing. Their Gale Arms and Gil Subzi were the most shrewd amongst the group, and thus knew what their leader currently lacked the most. Hence, both grinned and said, Your Majesty, we see that you've been training hard these past few days and didn't really come out to accept any missions, so you should be almost out of spirit jade pieces, right? If you need, we can give you some. Ezra thought for a bit but ultimately shook his head. No need for the time being. If it does come to that, I will go look for you guys. Alright then, I'll be heading to the Mystic Demon Library to return the spiritual technique Jade Strip. Ezra smiled at the group before he jumped off into the sky with his thundering lightning. As they watched him leave, the geniuses of Naren Continent exchanged a look and sighed. They did not truly understand Ezra Zephyr's current situation. Not to mention, even they were rejected by instructors because of their relationship with Ezra, but none dared to mention that. This is no good if this continues, we will not be able to learn even a single spiritual technique after the 3 months are over. What will we have to show in the peak selection ceremony then? When the prince once again arrived at the Mystic Demon Library, the passing disciples constantly swept their gazes towards him, gazes that were filled with pity. Ezra's expression remained calm as he proceeded to return the jade strip at the counter. Hee, isn't this Ezra? Have you learnt the Gossamer Steps technique yet? At this moment, mocking laughter was heard from the side. Ezra turned his head, seeing Moshi with several figures behind him, their eyes filled with a toying look as they watched the former. Evidently, Moshi had received news the moment Ezra arrived, and thus brought several others to come to watch. Ezra indifferently said, I've not seen your elder brother recently, is the wound on his face still not healed? And what about his leg? Too bad it can't be grown back. Such a pity that the instructor of Gossamer Steps doesn't have a leg to move like the wind. The razor pearl eagle already came back to him that night. He knew the amount of damage Roshi received. Moshi's expression turned rigid, a vicious look in his eyes as he glared at Ezra and said through gnashed teeth, "What's there to be proud of by relying on a beast?" Ezra smirked superficially as he retorted, "Are you saying that your elder brother is inferior to a beast? How dare you?" Moshi's eyes hardened as powerful spiritual energy exploded from his body. He stared daggers at Ezra and threatened, "Do you want to die? This is the Mystic Demon Library and fighting is prohibited here. Do all of you want to be punished?" A clear voice sounded from the side. They turned, only to realize Ravina Ingale was frowning slightly as she watched them. Moshi was enraged. "There is no longer anyone who will guide you in your spiritual techniques, so just wait and see, your first-class disciple status will likely be gone soon." Ezra Zephyr smirked and shook his head. "There's no need for you to worry. I'll see how long your stubbornness will last." Moshi coldly snorted, before turning around and leaving with his group. The numerous disciples in the vicinity looked towards Ezra in confusion before gradually scattering. Ezra Zephyr paid no attention to them as he gave a slight nod to Raven and Gale, before beginning to head down the mountain. The main thing now was to figure out how to obtain Spirit Jade. Should he really have to take on missions sooner than he planned? Ravina hesitated for a moment as she watched him leave, before suddenly catching up to him. "Ezra, you were too rash. How can you learn any spiritual techniques now that you've offended Roshi? If you really are a capable person, you should know when to give in or exercise patience. There will always be a chance to turn things around in the future." Ezra was somewhat astonished by Ravina's words. "You're worried about me?" The lady in red rolled her eyes at him and said, "This is called pity. I just don't want to see your talent being squandered away for no reason. Roshi's actions are indeed somewhat petty. You also doomed your fellow Naren disciples." The prince chuckled. He suddenly thought of something, rubbing his chin as he looked at Ravina with interest. The lady felt a little uncomfortable under his gaze. Her pretty face immediately turned slightly hostile as she fiercely said, "What are you looking at?" Ezra asked, "Do you have any friend training at Roshi's place?" The corners of Ravina's red lips lifted slightly, somewhat pleased as she answered, "Yes, she has already knitted her 7th yarn. She should be able to reach the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month." "The 7th yarn?" Ezra was taken aback. "Do you understand the benefits of having someone to guide you now? Did you think that 5 spirit jade pieces were being spent in vain every day?" Ravina looked at Ezra with a pitiful gaze. "Is it that easy to earn spirit jade?" Ezra's eyes glowed. Ravina's brows knitted together, somewhat unhappy as she shot a look at the prince and said in a disappointed manner, "I had thought that you would see the truth. Looks like there's really no saving you." She turned around as she spoke, intending to leave. However, Ezra hastily cut her off. Upon seeing her frown slightly, he hurriedly said, "If I have a method to let your friend master the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique and knit more yarns than at Roshi's place, would she be interested?" Ravina was stunned. "What nonsense are you spouting? Mastering the first level in 10 days, I've never heard of anyone who has managed to do so." Ezra smiled and said, "But what if it's true?" The lady pondered for a brief moment, before she replied, "Then she will naturally be interested. Spirit jade is secondary, the most important thing is to save my time." This was clearly a wealthy little lady, someone who practically didn't care about spirit jade. She suspiciously looked at Ezra and asked, "Do you know someone better in the Gossamer Steps technique than Roshi?" Ezra Zephyr grinned wickedly. "I do not know whether or not he's better than Roshi, but his efficiency is incomparable. If he can really let her reach the initial stage of the Gossamer Steps technique, I am willing to send my friend and others from the Ryan continent to learn from him. Spirit jade is not a problem." She stared at Ezra. Although she did not really believe him, he should not dare to joke about such a matter, right? Joy sprouted from between Ezra's brows as he pointed to himself with a smile, "That person is me, of course. Come on, it'll be 50 spirit jade pieces, you can pay half first." His voice didn't change, but Ravina's pretty face had abruptly turned ice cold. She made a grabbing motion with her hand, as the scarlet-red whip on her hip appeared within it. A fiendish look appeared on Ravina Ingale's pretty face as she swung the whip. "Ezra, I see that you're tired of living. To think that you even dare to make fun of me." The scarlet-red whip was akin to a fire python, giving off searing spiritual energy undulations as it swung down towards Ezra Zephyr's skull. The prince calmly dodged, causing the whip to narrowly miss his body and viciously smash into the ground, tearing open a long crack. Ezra shot daggers at her and asked, "What's the meaning of this?" This wasn't just a light smack on the face, but would likely leave a bloody scar. Ravina's hand jerked as the whip rolled back to her and wrapped around her wrist. She frostily glanced at Ezra and said, "Do you really think that I am lenient?" Ezra promptly shook his head at the sight of the somewhat angered Ravina Ingale and said with a smile, "Don't get so angry, I wasn't making fun of you. If you follow me, I can really allow you to achieve initial mastery of the Gossamer Steps technique in 10 days. Ravina Ingale frowned so deeply that her eyebrows were almost vertical as she sneered, "Arrogance, how long has it been since you started learning the Gossamer Steps technique? Have you even knit any yarns? Although Roshi's character is somewhat lacking, do you know how many yarns he has knitted? 41 yarns. How can you compare yourself to him?" Ezra Zephyr shook his head and said, "Only 41 yarns after practicing for so long. Roshi's talent is indeed quite mediocre. No wonder he's still a silver belt disciple." Shameless boasting. Ravina had reached the limits of her anger due to Ezra Zephyr's attitude. He was clearly nowhere as good as others, and yet he stubbornly refused to admit they were better. She had originally been a little interested in the talent Ezra had displayed, but she was now exceedingly disappointed. No matter how good one's talent is, if one was unable to realize one's faults, one would not be able to walk far on the road of martial prowess. Hence, she could no longer be bothered to stay a single second more and began to turn around to leave. Upon seeing this, Ezra Zephyr immediately said, "I don't think you'll believe me if I told you I've already knitted 31 yarns. How about this? Why not you punch me once to see?" 31 yarns? Ravina Inga gnashed her teeth. "It's only been 5 days, and you've knitted 31 yarns? Are you insulting my intelligence?" Ezra silently face-bombed. If not for the spirit jade, he would not bother explaining so much. He immediately extended a hand and beckoned. "Quit being so wishy-washy, you'll know once you attack." Ravina Ingale laughed in anger. This was the first time she had heard others make such an assessment of her. "Fine, I'll let you know the price of making fun of me." Her hand clenched as vigorous spiritual energy abruptly exploded from her body. Her spiritual energy was fiery red, like a wave of fire. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. She was indeed a formidable individual and was likely top tier even amongst the third-level core formation practitioners. In a real fight, she could be a good opponent to XYR. SWUUSSH. Ravina's foot pushed off the ground as her body shot forward. Surging spiritual energy gathered towards her hand as a simple punch was sent blasting forth. Bang! The air was blasted away by the punch, seemingly causing a sonic boom. The lady may look as delicate as a flower, but her attack was extremely simple and violent. If a second-level core formation disciples were to face this seemingly small fist instead, they would likely be forced to his knees. However, Ezra did not move at all. He watched the fist winds blast towards him and suddenly took a step forward. His hand reached out, black lightning thundering out as he met Ravina Ingale's punch head-on. Thud. A muffled noise rang out as winds violently unfurled, blowing away the scattered rocks around them. However, the instant palm met fist, Ravina's face suddenly changed. She had felt a large portion of her power being neutralized when it surged towards Ezra Zephyr. It felt as if most of her punch had landed on air. Ravina concentrated on Ezra Zephyr's palm, only for her heart to shake violently. She had seen his palm seem to turn slightly incorporeal at this moment, giving off a faintly gossamer feeling. How can this be? The lady in red could not help but cry out. She clearly understood that this was a sign that someone was about to reach the initial stage of the Gossamer Steps technique. Only then would one be able to make part of their body gossamer, causing the power of any attack that landed on that part to be greatly neutralized. This was the essence of the gossamer steps technique. When mastered, any attack that landed would feel as if it had struck air, causing a portion of its power to be neutralized. The fact that Ezra Zephyr was able to make his hand gossamer meant that his mastery of the gossamer steps technique had already far surpassed her own. With the 7 yarns her friend had currently knitted, achieving with a feat would be impossible for her. The prince slowly withdrew his hand as it rapidly returned to normal, and let out a soft laugh of satisfaction. The gossamer steps technique was marvelous indeed, and would greatly enhance his survivability once mastered. This would be an invaluable skill indeed to counter any sudden or sneak attacks. At the second level, one would be able to turn the entire body gossamer, making one akin to the wind. As for the third level, it was even more amazing. One would be capable of full gossamer, giving one the ability to merge with the wind around. From a certain point of view, it could be said to be invisibility that could also avoid others' detection. Overall, the gossamer steps technique was a wonderful technique that could pretty much cover every aspect of survivability, from defense to escaping and hiding. This was also why Ezra had not hesitated to choose it the moment he saw it. Ravina and Gale blankly stared at Ezra Zephyr, not knowing what to see for a time. What had just happened was way too shocking. She was unable to believe that Ezra Zephyr was nearly at the initial stage after a mere 5 days of practice. "You've really knitted 31 yarns?" Ezra simply chuckled. "You should at least believe your own eyes, right? How did you do it?" The prince's smile widened. "Perhaps my talent is just better, how about it? Are you interested to send your friend here? I should be able to guarantee you reaching the first level of the gossamer steps technique in 10 days. He did not dare to make any guarantees for the second level, because he could already feel how increasingly difficult it was becoming to sense and knit the latter yarns. Even with his talent, it would take some time. Ravina's eyes flickered brightly as she stared at Ezra Zephyr. She had originally been under the impression that he was spouting nonsense. Who could have expected that he would be so capable? Even without anyone's guidance, he had rapidly progressed at such an astonishing speed. "This is 50 spirit jade pieces." Ravina Ingale was a swift and decisive person. Since she had already personally witnessed it, there was naturally no need to delay. With a flick of her wrist, a cloth bag was thrown towards Ezra Zephyr, the clear tinkling of spirit jade pieces clearly heard as it flew through the air. "How generous." Ezra Zephyr raised his thumb in response. She was indeed a rich little lady, not even a single grumble, before paying the full amount. To think that he was originally planning on only taking half the payment first. "But where did you get so many spirit jade pieces?" the prince curiously asked. He had not seen Ravina Ingale undertake any missions, and yet she seemed to be very wealthy. "Why be such a busybody?" the lady rolled her eyes at him. The prince nodded in understanding. As expected, she did have ties in the sect. In the Mystic Demon Library, Ravina Ingale was still hesitant. "Ezra, I'm warning you that my money is not so easily earned. If my people do not reach the first level after 10 days," Ravina Ingale shot a look at Ezra Zephyr. "I will not let you off." At that time, the expressions of Ezra Zephyr changed. "Listen, lady, this is your 3rd time threatening me. Let me be clear." A dominating aura came out of Ezra as he continued. "I don't give a shit about your connections. I am capable of killing the likes of you and that Drake Tubble. Be a little respectful." Ravina's eyes widened, and she saw death in Ezra's scarlet eyes. She was still stunned when Ezra spoke again. "Relax, this is already a bargain and I will not cheat anyone," he hurriedly pledged. This was his first customer, and he had to make sure she was satisfied at all costs. However, he has his pride as well. Ravina came back to her senses. She replied, "When should I send her to begin training? Our time is precious, so we'll of course be starting now." "Send her." Ezra Zephyr waved his hand, tossing the bag of spirit jade and the bracelet as he walked down the mountain. Ravina Ingale looked at his leaving figure, before looking towards the lecture halls in the rear mountain as she hesitated for a moment. Before jumping towards the halls, Roshi watched the numerous unofficial outer mountain disciples arrive one after another and suddenly frowned. He had not seen a lady disciple amongst them. At this moment, Moshi suddenly rushed over, his expression extremely ugly. Roshi frowned and asked, "What is it?" The other disciples also looked over. Moshi hesitated for a second, somewhat unable to believe his own words as he explained, "Mahi and Gale sent someone to say that she will not be coming." Not coming? Roshi was taken aback, somewhat unhappy as he said, "Wasn't she doing well so far? Does she no longer plan on learning the Gossamer Steps technique?" Mahi and Gale was the cousin of Ravina and Gale and was from a powerful background, while also being very pretty. Hence, Roshi had some designs on her and was currently attempting to fulfill the dream of marrying into power and wealth, hoping to make use of this opportunity while teaching her to get into her good books. Mahi's sudden absence had disrupted his tempo. Moshi summoned his courage and said, She's still learning, but she has gone to learn from Ezra Zephyr and Ravina and Gale was with her." The lecture hall immediately fell silent, numerous disciples looking at each other first, before quickly breaking out into a din. Ezra Zephyr of Naren Continent? Mahi is learning the Gossamer Steps technique from Ezra Zephyr? What the heck is she doing? Roshi was also stupefied. Soon after, his complexion turned steely green with rage. He was truly unable to comprehend what Mahi and Gale was thinking. Did she sustain some brain damage? It was preposterous for her to learn spiritual techniques from another unofficial outer mountain disciple. What kind of drug had Ezra given her? Most importantly, if news of this spread, where would Roshi be able to hide his face? He gnashed his teeth, no longer able to restrain his emotions. He violently kicked a nearby table to dust, his expression twisting as he roared, "Ezra Zephyr, you're practically asking for death." Roshi raged in the hall, his twisted expression causing the unofficial outer mountain disciples to keep silent out of fear. He was undoubtedly akin to a volcano on the verge of eruption at this moment. Although Roshi was seeing red, he still retained some of his rationality, and soon took in a deep breath. He knew that if an official outer mountain disciple like himself were to lash out at Ezra Zephyr in a fit of rage for no real reason, it would be a violation of the rules. Of course, the most important factor was the extremely powerful mysterious creature at Ezra Zephyr's side, which was way stronger than himself. Even if he did try something, it would likely not end well for him. Roshi's anger gradually returned to calmness, though his face remained stormy. He looked at the crowd of disciples and flatly said, "Continue your training. This is Mahi's personal decision, so no one can interfere. I do hope that this great master she has found will be able to help her advance by leaps and bounds." At this point, everyone could hear the hint of ridicule in his voice. Evidently, he felt that Mahi and Gale was asking for trouble. It was hard to believe that she had become so muddle-headed because of Ezra Zephyr. The other disciples nodded one after another, though a puzzled look remained in their eyes. Why has Mahi chosen to learn from Ezra Zephyr? Could she be interested in him? No, Moshi said Ravina was with her as well. Ravina? That prodigy. However, these words were immediately rebutted in a clearly sore manner. How can that be possible? Who do you think Mahi is? How can she possibly fancy that country bumpkin? Then why did she do that? This. Everyone looked at each other, unable to think of an answer. Moshi tried to pacify Roshi. "Don't worry, elder brother, when Mahi returns to her senses, she will realize Ezra's true colors. When that happens, she will definitely return." Roshi coldly snorted as he uncaringly said, "It is her choice, so she'll bear the consequences. If she continued under my tutelage, with her talent, she would have mastered the first level of the Gossamer Steps technique in a month." He shook his head, as if feeling that it was such a pity. But who could have imagined that she would choose to ruin her own future? I do want to see how much she will be able to learn from Ezra. If word of this matter spreads to the ears of that elder of Ingale clan, that person will not forgive Ezra Zephyr. A mocking angle seemed to be hooked up from the corners of Roshi's lips, as if he could already see Ezra's tragic fate.